Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a time when life was full of strict rules for most folks, yet a few dared to break every one of them and sail straight into trouble on the open sea. We're following the story of Bonny, a woman whose short time as a pirate in the early 1700s turned her into one of the most talked about figures from that wild era of Caribbean buccaneers. Imagine the salt air, the creak of wooden ships, and the constant push and pull between the old ways back in Europe and the rough new chances in the colonies. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening tonight, drop a quick comment with your location and the local time where you are. It's always interesting to see where people settle in for these quiet evenings. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins around the year 1697, near the city of Cork on the southern coast of Ireland. A girl was born into circumstances that already carried a quiet strain of scandal. Her father was William Cormac, a respectable attorney who handled property disputes and wills for local landowners. Her mother was Mary Brennan, a young servant who worked in the Cormac household. The relationship between them was never meant to become public knowledge. When Mary became pregnant, the situation could not be hidden for long. In the tightly knit Protestant merchant circles of late 17th century Cork, an affair between a married lawyer and his servant threatened more than personal reputation. It risked business connections, church standing, and the fragile social order that kept families like the Cormacs comfortable. William's wife had no children of her own, which made the birth of an illegitimate daughter both a private embarrassment and a potential legal complication later on. To manage the gossip, the household arranged for Mary and the infant to be cared for away from the main residence. Neighbours noticed the sudden quiet around the Cormac home whenever questions about heirs arose. Some whispered that William had quietly provided for the child while keeping her existence at arm's length. Others claimed he intended to bring the girl into the household under a different pretense entirely. By the time the child was old enough to walk and speak, the arrangement had become unsustainable. William decided to acknowledge her openly, presenting her as his daughter from a previous, vague union that few people could verify. He gave her the name Anne. The official story was thin, but in a port city accustomed to sailors disappearing for years and returning with new wives or children, it was just plausible enough to quiet the worst of the talk. Anne grew up inside the respectable stone house on the edge of Cork's bustling quays. The air carried the constant smell of salt, fish, coal smoke and wet wool. Ships unloaded barrels of butter, hides and linen, while others loaded with salted beef and passengers bound for the colonies. Servants moved through the narrow streets carrying baskets of bread and peat. Anne would have heard Irish spoken in the markets and English in her father's study. Her early years passed in the ordinary rhythm of a prosperous but watchful household. Mary Brennan remained close, tending to Anne's needs and teaching her the small domestic skills expected of a girl in that position: sewing, reading simple prayers, helping with kitchen tasks. William made sure Anne received lessons in writing and basic sums, so she would not grow up entirely uneducated. Yet the undercurrent of her origins never quite disappeared. Servants sometimes spoke more freely when they thought no one important was listening, and children in the neighbourhood occasionally repeated the sharper versions of the story they had overheard. Anne learned early to carry herself with a certain guarded calm. She preferred watching the ships from the windows or the quayside rather than joining the games of other girls her age. The sight of sails filling with wind and the slow creak of ropes against masts stayed with her longer than stories of needlework or proper behaviour. Around 1701 or 1702, when Anne was 4 or 5, the pressure in Cork became too great. William's legal practice suffered as clients quietly took their business elsewhere. The scandal, though old, still lingered in the memory of people who mattered. He began making plans to leave Ireland altogether. The American colonies, particularly the Carolinas, were attracting settlers with promises of land and new starts. William had contacts among merchants already trading there. The decision was presented to the household as an opportunity rather than a flight. Mary would travel as his wife officially now, and Anne as their legitimate daughter. A story was prepared. The family had decided to seek warmer climate and fresh prospects after years of hard work in Ireland. Some belongings were sold quietly, others packed into trunks bound for the crossing. The voyage itself took weeks. The ship rolled through the grey Atlantic, carrying the smells of tar, damp timber, and unwashed passengers. Anne, still small, spent long hours below deck when the weather turned rough, listening to the groan of the hull and the muffled shouts of the crew. Mary stayed close, steadying her when seasickness struck. William spent much of the time on deck, speaking with the captain and other passengers about land grants and trade possibilities. They landed at last in Charlestown, in the province of Carolina, sometime in the early years of the new century. The humid air struck them immediately thick, carrying the scent of pine, marsh, and distant wood smoke. The settlement was still young, a mix of wooden houses, muddy streets, and wharves stretching along the Cooper River. Rice and naval stores were beginning to replace earlier experiments with other crops. Enslaved Africans worked the fields beyond the town, and indentured servants moved through the markets. William quickly set about establishing himself. He used his legal knowledge to handle deeds and disputes for new planters. Within a few years he had acquired land and begun building a modest plantation. The family moved into a larger house with a wide porch and shutters against the heat. Anne, now 7 or 8, explored the sandy paths and watched small boats gliding past on the river. The change was complete. In Cork they had lived under the weight of old gossip. Here, few people knew their past. William's status rose steadily. He joined the local vestry and became a figure of quiet influence among the growing planter class. Mary adapted to the role of wife in a new society, managing the household and the small staff that included both free and enslaved workers. Anne moved through these years with the same watchful attention she had always shown. She noticed the differences, the slower pace of speech, the heavier reliance on rice and corn instead of oats and potatoes, the constant presence of mosquitoes and the need for netting over beds at night. She learned to ride, the small horses kept for plantation work, sitting astride rather than side saddle when no one was watching. The household observed the customs of the Church of England. Sundays meant services in the wooden church, followed by quiet afternoons. Anne sat through the long sermons, her mind often drifting to the river and the ships that still came and went from the harbour. Even in this new life, the sea remained close visible from the upper windows, audible in the calls of gulls and the creak of rigging carried on the breeze. Yet the sea that now remained close in this new Carolina life reminded the family daily of the crossing that had been their escape from the intense social backlash in Ireland. William Cormac had watched his once solid position as an attorney in court crumble under the weight of public disapproval. The affair with Mary Brennan had been tolerated in private, but once the birth became impossible to hide, the merchant families who supplied his clients began to withdraw their business one by one. Church wardens made quiet inquiries about the moral fitness of his household, and several long-standing contracts for land surveys were quietly reassigned to other lawyers. Even the servants in neighbouring homes began to refuse errands to the Cormac door. To leave without drawing further attention, William arranged a careful sequence of steps. The family first travelled north to a small port town in England under the pretence of visiting relatives for health reasons. They spent nearly a month there, staying in modest lodgings and letting local talk spread that they were a respectable couple seeking warmer climates after years of Irish damp. This short stay allowed them to board a larger vessel leaving from a busy English quay rather than the familiar Cork docks, where their names might still have raised eyebrows. The trunks were labelled with a simple family name, and the story they carried was that of a routine relocation prompted by opportunity in the colonies. The Atlantic crossing stretched over 7 weeks of rolling grey water and cramped quarters below deck. Young Anne, barely 5 at the time, spent most days clinging to her mother's side while the ship pitched through heavy swells. The air below was thick with the smell of bilge water, salted pork, and the unwashed clothes of dozens of other passengers. Meals came as hard biscuit and thin stew ladled from a shared pot, and fresh water was rationed so strictly that everyone learned to sip slowly. When storms struck, the crew lashed the hatches shut and the passengers lay in their narrow bunks listening to the timber groan and the waves crash overhead. Mary kept Anne occupied with simple counting games and quiet songs in Irish, anything to distract from the constant motion and the fear that the hull might give way. William spent his hours on deck when weather permitted, talking with the captain about trade routes and the price of rice in Carolina, gathering whatever scraps of information he could to prepare for the life ahead. Landing at last in Charlestown brought an immediate rush of new sensations. The air felt heavier and warmer, carrying the sharp scent of marsh mud and pine resin. The wooden wharves were crowded with barrels of naval stores and bales of cotton, while small boats ferried goods up the Cooper River. The family stepped ashore with only the belongings that had survived the voyage, their clothes stiff with salt. For the first weeks, they rented a single room in a boarding house near the market square, where enslaved workers carried water and firewood past the door each morning. William used his remaining savings and letters of introduction to secure a small plot of land outside town. He began filing simple deeds for other planters, slowly rebuilding the network he had lost in Cork. Mary adapted quickly to the household routines of the colony. She learned to cook with cornmeal instead of oats, boiling it into thick porridge sweetened with molasses that the family ate at a rough pine table. Clothing changed too. Lighter linens replaced the heavy wool of Ireland, and wide-brimmed hats became necessary against the glaring sun. Anne, still small, followed her mother through the sandy yard, watching the enslaved field hands move between rows of young rice plants. The plantation house they eventually built was modest, one story with a broad porch raised on brick pillars to catch any breeze. Inside, the room smelled of fresh-cut cedar and the smoke from the cooking hearth. The political and social forces of the young colony shaped every part of their adjustment. Carolina was still recovering from earlier conflicts with the Spanish to the south and the native tribes to the west. Governor Moore had recently led expeditions that brought back captured Indians sold into slavery, and the trade in enslaved Africans was expanding rapidly to meet the demand for rice cultivation. William kept his opinions measured in public, focusing instead on drafting clear contracts that protected the small planters against larger landowners. He joined the local militia drills on Saturdays, marching with other men in the dusty square while Anne watched from the shade of a live oak. The family attended services in the wooden Anglican church, where sermons reminded everyone of the need for order in a frontier settlement. Inside the household, the memory of the Irish scandal lingered in small, unspoken ways. William spoke less freely at meals, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had once lost everything to gossip. Mary carried herself with a quiet dignity, managing the few servants and the kitchen garden with steady hands that showed no sign of the strain she had endured. Anne sensed the careful distance between her parents and the world outside. She noticed how her father paused before answering questions about their past, how her mother glanced toward the door whenever visitors arrived. These habits became part of daily life without ever being named. As the months turned into years, the plantation began to produce its first modest harvests. Rice fields flooded and drained according to the tides, and the family stored the surplus in wooden sheds beside the river. Anne, now 8, helped carry water to the workers and learned the rhythm of the seasons, planting in spring, weeding through the humid summer, harvesting before the autumn storms. She developed a habit of slipping away to the riverbank whenever the work slowed, sitting on a fallen log to watch the small trading sloops pass. The water was brown and slow-moving, nothing like the crashing waves of the Atlantic crossing, but it still pulled at her attention. The culture of the colony mixed English traditions with practical adaptations. Sundays remained quiet, with long sermons followed by simple meals of roasted chicken and cornbread. Evenings often ended with stories told around the hearth about earlier settlers who had survived Indian raids or hurricanes. William kept account books by candlelight, recording every bushel and every shilling, determined that the new start would not slip away. Mary taught Anne basic sewing and reading, using a worn primer brought from Ireland. The girl's fingers grew calloused from helping in the garden, and she began to carry herself with the same guarded watchfulness her parents had developed during the difficult years of transition. Social ranks in Charlestown were still fluid, but clear lines existed between the planter families and the labourers. The Cormacs occupied a middle ground, respectable enough to be invited to occasional dinners, but not wealthy enough to host them. William's legal skills earned him steady work, yet the shadow of their origins meant they never spoke openly about the past. Neighbours occasionally asked how they had come to the colony, and the family answered with the practice story of opportunity and health. No one pressed further. Daily routines settled into a steady pattern. Breakfast was corn porridge with a bit of salt pork. Midday meals were taken in the fields or under the porch shade. Supper brought everyone together to discuss the weather, the price of lumber, or the latest news from England carried by incoming ships. Anne listened more than she spoke, storing away details about distant ports and the men who sailed them. The plantation house grew more comfortable with each passing season, new shutters against the mosquitoes, a larger hearth for winter, and a small stable for the horses William used on his legal rounds. The move across the ocean had done what it was meant to do. The family had left the worst of the Irish backlash behind, but the experience had marked them in ways that showed in small daily choices. William worked longer hours to secure their position. Mary maintained a calm order in the home that kept any lingering gossip at bay. Anne absorbed the lesson that safety came from careful silence and steady work. The sea that had carried them here still lay just beyond the fields, a constant presence that would later pull her attention in directions none of them could yet imagine. Settling in South Carolina, the arrival in Charlestown marked the true beginning of a different existence for the Cormac family. The settlement in those early years of the 18th century was still more outpost than city. Wooden buildings lined the streets running back from the river, their roofs slanted against the frequent rains. The main wharves extended into the Cooper River like long fingers, where sloops and brigantines tied up to unload barrels of rum, tools, cloth, and enslaved people brought directly from Africa or through the West Indies. The air stayed thick with humidity even in winter, and the ground underfoot remained soft and sandy except where wooden planks had been laid down to keep boots out of the mud. William Cormac wasted little time. Within weeks of landing, he presented his letters of introduction to several merchants and planters who had connections back in England and Ireland. His training as an attorney proved immediately useful in a colony where land claims overlapped constantly and disputes over boundaries or inheritance were common. He took on small cases, drafting wills, settling debts between neighbours, recording transfers of property, and charged modest fees that allowed the family to rent a narrow clapboard house near the waterfront. The rent was paid in rice or naval stores when coin was short, a practice everyone accepted without comment. The household settled into routines shaped by the climate and the economy. Mornings started before dawn with the sound of roosters and the low voices of enslaved workers heading to the fields. Mary rose first to build the fire in the open hearth and prepare breakfast. Cornmeal mush, cooked with a strip of salt pork, sometimes sweetened with a little molasses, if the last shipment from Barbados had included extra. Anne helped carry water from the well in wooden buckets, learning to balance the yoke across her shoulders without spilling. The water tasted faintly of iron and needed to be boiled before drinking to avoid the flux that still carried off newcomers. By mid-morning the heat had already built, and everyone moved more slowly under it. William rode out on a borrowed horse to meet clients at their plantations, or to inspect disputed land along the Ashley River. He wore a lightweight linen coat and a wide hat, carrying a satchel of papers tied with string. When he returned in the late afternoon, he sat at a small desk in the front room, dipping a quill in ink made from oak galls and writing out contracts by the light of a single tallow candle. The smell of hot wax and melting tallow became part of the house. Mary managed the domestic side with quiet efficiency. She oversaw the small kitchen garden behind the house, rows of collards, okra, sweet potatoes and beans, tended by one enslaved woman named Suki who had been purchased soon after their arrival. Suki also helped with laundry, scrubbing linens in a wooden tub with lye soap that stung the hands. Clothing was simple and practical, shifts of coarse linen for everyday wear, heavier skirts and bodices for cooler months, and aprons that protected against grease and soot. Anne wore the same style of dress as her mother, but in smaller sizes, with her hair tied back in a single braid to keep it out of the way during chores. The streets of Charlestown offered their own lessons in the colony's social order. Market days brought crowds to the square where vendors sold fresh fish, Indian corn, deer hides, and imported goods like nails, glass beads, and bolts of calico. Enslaved people moved through the throng carrying baskets on their heads or leading mules loaded with firewood. Free blacks ran small shops or worked as artisans, blacksmiths, coopers, tailors, though they remained few in number and carefully watched. Anne often accompanied her mother to market, holding the basket while Mary bargained for flour or candles. She noticed how people spoke differently depending on who stood nearby: polite English with planters, brisk commands to labourers, and a careful neutrality with everyone else. The political structure of Carolina reinforced these divisions. The Lords Proprietors still held nominal control from England, but local power rested with the governor and the Commons House of Assembly, filled mostly by wealthy planters. Taxes fell heavily on small farmers and labourers, while large landholders received generous grants and exemptions. William aligned himself quietly with the moderate faction, avoiding the louder debates over Indian trade or the expansion of rice planting. He understood that stability mattered more than principle in a place where hurricanes could destroy a season's crop overnight, and Spanish privateers still raided the coast. Daily life carried its own small rituals. Evenings brought the family together around a trestle table for supper, often a stew of turtle, rice, and whatever vegetables were ready, eaten with wooden spoons. After the meal, William sometimes read aloud from a shared Bible or a London almanac that arrived irregularly with the ships. Anne listened while mending stockings or shelling peas, her mind half on the words and half on the sounds drifting in from the river, the slap of water against pilings, the creak of moored vessels, the occasional shout of a watchman calling the hour. As the years passed, William's practice grew. He acquired his first parcel of land, 100 acres along a creek, where rice could be planted with tidal irrigation. The family moved to a larger house on the plantation itself, a 2-room structure with a detached kitchen and a porch that caught the evening breeze off the water. The new home stood on slightly higher ground to avoid flooding, surrounded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Anne, now 10 or 11, spent more time outdoors. She learned to ride the sturdy ponies kept for plantation errands, sitting astride with her skirts tucked up when no adults were watching. She developed a habit of walking the rice fields in the late afternoon, watching the water flood and drain through the trunks that controlled the flow. The presence of slavery shaped every aspect of daily existence. Enslaved workers, men, women, and children, lived in small cabins behind the main house. They rose before light to tend the fields, repair tools, or fish the creeks for extra food. Their labour produced the rice that paid for imported goods and allowed William to expand his holdings. Anne saw them at close range, the way they moved in rhythm through the rows, the songs they sang in low voices to keep time, the careful way they avoided direct eye contact with the family unless spoken to. She heard fragments of Gullah spoken among them, a language blending English with African words and structures that she could not fully understand but recognized as different from the speech of the house. Social customs remained strict, especially for girls of Anne's station. She was expected to learn household management, baking bread, preserving fruit, overseeing laundry so she could one day run a home of her own. Yet she resisted the finer points of needlework and deportment. When visitors came, usually other planters or merchants, she sat quietly in the corner, listening to talk of crop prices, militia musters, and news from London that arrived months late. The conversations rarely included her, but she absorbed the undercurrents. The fear of Spanish incursions, the tension over runaway slaves heading south to Spanish Florida, the constant calculation of profit against weather and disease. Through all of this, the sea stayed near. Charlestown remained a port first and foremost. Ships brought news, goods and people, sailors with sunburned faces and stories of storms in the Caribbean, merchants negotiating deals over rum and sugar, passengers seeking new starts after failures elsewhere. Anne often slipped down to the wharves when chores allowed, standing at the edge of the dock to watch the vessels unload. The smell of tar and rope, the rattle of blocks and chains, the shouts of men hauling cargo, all of it felt more alive than the slow rhythm of the plantation. She began to linger longer each time, unnoticed at first, then noticed but not yet corrected. The years in Carolina hardened the family's new identity. William became known as a reliable attorney and a steady planter. Mary managed the household with calm competence. Anne grew taller, stronger, and more restless, carrying inside her the same guarded watchfulness that had helped them survive the scandal in Ireland and the uncertain crossing. The humid air, the muddy river, the constant labour of the fields, and the distant call of ships combined into the background of her adolescence, shaping habits and ambitions that would soon pull her away from the life her parents had so carefully rebuilt. Mother's death and fiery youth Mary, Brennan's health began to fail gradually in the summer of 1709. She was then in her early 30s, worn down by the years of adjustment to Carolina's climate, the constant work of managing a growing household, and the lingering effects of the Atlantic crossing that had never fully left her body. At first the symptoms seemed ordinary persistent fatigue, a dry cough that worsened at night, occasional fevers that came and went with the humid weather. The family doctor, a Scotsman who rode out from Charlestown once a month, prescribed rest, willow bark tea, and lighter duties. Mary tried to follow the advice, but the plantation could not pause. Rice planting demanded attention through the hot months, and the kitchen garden still needed tending. By early autumn, the cough had deepened into something more serious. She lost weight steadily, her cheeks hollowed, and her breathing grew laboured even when sitting still. William arranged for her to be moved to the cooler upper room of the house, away from the hearth smoke and the dust raised by field work. Anne, now 12, took over many of her mother's tasks, carrying meals upstairs, changing the linens soaked with night sweats, sitting beside the bed to read aloud from the family Bible when Mary could not sleep. The room smelled of vinegar-soaked cloths used to cool her forehead, and the faint metallic scent of blood she sometimes coughed into a basin. Mary died in late November. On a clear night when the moon hung low over the river, the end came quietly. She simply stopped breathing while Anne held her hand. William stood at the foot of the bed, silent, then turned to make arrangements with the neighbours who had come to help. A simple pine coffin was built in the barn by one of the carpenters, and the burial took place the next afternoon in the small family plot behind the live oaks. No large gathering, only the household, a few nearby planters, and the minister who read the burial service from the Book of Common Prayer. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the shovel work left dark streaks on the men's shirts. Anne stood apart during the service, watching the dirt fall in small clumps onto the lid. She felt the loss in stages. First, the immediate absence, the empty chair at the table, the quiet kitchen without Mary's steady movements. Then the deeper realization that the one person who had known her entire story, from the Cork scandal onward, was gone. William tried to fill the gap by keeping routines strict. Meals continued at the same hours, chores were assigned clearly, and he spoke to Anne in the same measured tone he used with the field hands. But the house felt larger and emptier. Suki and the other enslaved workers moved more carefully around Anne, sensing the change without being told. Grief settled into Anne differently than it did for her father. William buried himself in work, longer hours on legal papers, more frequent rides to Charlestown, extra attention to the rice yields. Anne turned outward. She began spending more time away from the house, riding the small mare named Bess along the plantation paths and out toward the river. She rode astride, skirts hiked up to her knees, hair loose under a wide hat. The motion of the horse, the wind against her face, the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth gave her something to focus on. Besides the silence at home, she developed a habit of stopping at the wharves whenever she reached town. The docks were busier now, with more ships arriving as Carolina's trade grew. She stood among the barrels and coils of rope, watching sailors unload cargo, crates of sugar, casks of rum, bolts of cloth dyed bright indigo. She listened to their talk. Complaints about short rations, boasts about storms survived, stories of ports in Jamaica and the Bahamas where men made quick money and spent it faster. The language was rougher than anything she heard at home, full of swearing and quick laughter, and she absorbed it without flinching. Back at the plantation, her behaviour began to draw notice. She argued with the overseer over small matters, how the horses were fed, which fields needed draining next, using words she had picked up at the docks. William corrected her sharply the first few times, reminding her of her place and the expectations for a young woman of their station. She listened, nodded, then continued the same way when he was not present. The servants noticed her sharper tone, and the way she carried herself, shoulders back, chin up, eyes meeting theirs directly, instead of dropping as propriety demanded. One incident in particular spread through the neighbourhood. In the spring of 1710, a few months after Mary's death, Anne was helping in the kitchen when a young servant girl, newly purchased and about 14, made a careless remark. The girl, trying to join a conversation among the older women, repeated a piece of gossip she had overheard in town, that Anne was not truly William's daughter by a proper wife, but the child of a servant from Ireland. The words hung in the warm air for a moment. Anne turned, set down the wooden bowl she was holding, and walked straight to the girl. Without a word, she picked up a small paring knife from the table and drove it into the girl's upper arm just below the shoulder. The blade went in perhaps an inch, enough to draw blood and cause a sharp cry, but not enough to kill or maim permanently. The household froze. Suki pulled Anne back, while another woman pressed a cloth to the wound. William was summoned from the fields. He examined the injury, had it cleaned with rum and bandaged, then sent the girl to rest in the quarters. To Anne, he said nothing in front of the others. Later, in the front room with the door closed, he spoke in a low, controlled voice. He told her the act could bring serious trouble. Assault on a servant was a matter for the courts if reported, and word travelled quickly. He made her stay indoors for 2 weeks, no riding, no trips to town. Anne accepted the punishment without protest, but she did not apologise. The story circulated quietly among the plantations. Some called it a sign of bad blood from the mother's side. Others said the girl had been insolent and got what she deserved. No formal complaint was ever made. William, standing as an attorney and planter, helped keep the matter contained. But the incident marked a shift. Anne became known as quick-tempered, someone not to cross lightly. Neighbours watched her more closely when she passed on the road, and the servants spoke to her with extra caution. Through her 13th and 14th years she grew taller and stronger. Her hands, already calloused from garden work, developed new toughness from handling reins and saddles. She kept her hair braided tightly but let strands escape when riding alone. She read whatever books came into the house, mostly religious tracts and almanacs, but preferred the few travel accounts William brought back from Charlestown. She studied the maps folded inside them, tracing coastlines with her finger, memorizing names like Nassau, Port Royal, Havana. William tried to guide her toward a more conventional path. He spoke of suitable matches, sons of neighbouring planters, young clerks in town, men who could offer stability and land. Anne listened politely but gave no encouragement. She had seen the lives of the women around her, endless household management, childbirth, the slow narrowing of days into routine. The idea of that future felt confining, like a door closing. The docks remained her escape. She began slipping away more often, sometimes staying until dusk when the lanterns were lit on the ships and the sailors sang work songs while stowing gear. She asked questions when she could: how long a crossing to the Bahamas took, what the islands looked like, whether women ever sailed on those vessels. The answers varied. Some men laughed, others shrugged and said the sea was no place for ladies, but she kept asking. Inside, the restlessness grew. Grief for her mother had hardened into something else, a steady determination to choose her own direction. She felt the weight of expectations, her father's plans, society's rules, the careful life rebuilt after Ireland and pushed against it. The sea, visible from every high point on the plantation, offered the clearest alternative. Not yet a plan, but a pull that strengthened with each passing month. Rebellion against expectations. Anne reached her 16th year in 1713 with a clear sense that the life laid out for her no longer fit. William Cormac had begun speaking more frequently about marriage prospects. He mentioned names during supper: Thomas Fenwick, the son of a neighbouring rice planter whose fields bordered theirs to the north, or young Mr. Rutledge, recently arrived from England with a small inheritance and ambitions to enter the legal trade under William's guidance. These conversations were presented as practical discussions: land that could be joined, alliances that would strengthen the family's position in the growing colony, security for a daughter who would one day need a household of her own. Anne responded with short nods and brief answers. She understood the logic. Carolina's planter society rewarded careful marriages. Women who married well gained access to more slaves, larger acreage, and social invitations to the governor's house in Charlestown. Yet each mention of a suitor tightened something inside her. She pictured the years ahead: mornings spent directing house slaves, afternoons overseeing sewing circles, evenings hosting dinners where men talked crops and politics while women managed polite smiles. The image felt like a slow suffocation. She began spending less time in the house during daylight hours. After morning chores, milking the few cows kept for the family's use, sweeping the wide porch, helping Suki prepare the midday meal, she would saddle Bess and ride out along the creek paths. The mare knew the routes by heart: narrow trails through pine woods where sunlight filtered in long shafts, past stands of cypress draped in moss, down to the brackish edges where the river met the sea. Anne rode without a side saddle, legs gripping the horse's sides, skirts bunched at her waist. The freedom of movement, the wind pulling at her braid, the absence of watching eyes gave her a temporary release from the weight of expectation. The port of Charlestown drew her most often. The town had grown noticeably since their arrival a decade earlier. New brick warehouses lined the waterfront, their upper stories used as counting houses. Taverns clustered near the docks, low wooden buildings with signs painted in faded red and gold, where sailors and merchants mixed with local tradesmen. Anne tied Bess to a post outside one of the quieter ones, the Blue Anchor, and slipped inside when the crowd was thin. She sat in a corner near the open window, nursing a small mug of small beer, and listened. The talk inside carried the pulse of the wider world. Men spoke of the Treaty of Utrecht, signed the previous year, which had ended the long war with Spain and France. Privateering commissions had dried up overnight. Ships once licensed to prey on enemy vessels now faced unemployment, or the choice to turn pirate outright. Captains grumbled about reduced trade, while others boasted of quick runs to the Bahamas where law was thin and opportunities thick. Anne absorbed the details without interrupting. The names of vessels, the routes through the Windward Passage, the prices fetched for captured cargo in Nassau or Port Royal. She asked questions when the moment felt safe, usually to an older sailor nursing his own drink alone. How long did a sloop take to reach New Providence? What sort of men crewed those ships? Were there rules aboard, or did each captain make his own? The answers came gruff but patient. A good captain shared spoils fairly, they said. A bad one kept everything and risked mutiny. Women rarely sailed, though a few had crossed as passengers or disguised servants. The idea lodged in her mind without fanfare. Back at the plantation, tensions mounted. William noticed her absences and the salt stains on her skirts from dockside spray. He questioned her sharply one evening after she returned late, hair tangled and cheeks flushed from the ride. She answered that she had been checking the fences along the creek, a believable excuse since storms had recently toppled several posts. He accepted it but warned her against wandering too far. The roads were not always safe with runaway slaves and deserters moving through the woods. Anne kept her routine. She developed small habits that marked her growing independence. Keeping a short knife tucked into her boot, learned from watching field hands sharpen theirs. tying her hair in a practical knot instead of the neat coils expected of young ladies, practicing knots with scraps of rope she brought home from the docks, bowlines, clove hitches, sheet bends until her fingers moved automatically. These were quiet acts of preparation, done in the privacy of the stable or her small bedroom under the eaves. Social events became another point of friction. William arranged for her to attend a series of dinners and assemblies in Charlestown gatherings, where eligible daughters were displayed like goods at market. She went, when required, dressed in the best linen gown the household possessed, hair pinned with borrowed combs. At the tables she sat straight-backed and spoke when spoken to, but her answers were brief and her eyes drifted toward the windows overlooking the harbour. Other girls her age chatted easily about needlework patterns or the latest London fashions carried on incoming ships. Anne found little to add. When dancing began after supper, she joined the sets with mechanical steps, her mind elsewhere. One such evening in the spring of 1714 stood out. The gathering was at the home of a wealthy merchant on Meeting Street. The rooms were lit with wax candles, the air thick with perfume and tobacco smoke. Anne wore a borrowed gown of pale blue silk, tight at the waist and heavy with petticoats. During the interval between dances, a young clerk, polite, well-spoken, clearly interested, approached her with compliments on her grace and questions about plantation life. She answered courteously but without warmth. When he pressed for a second dance, she excused herself, claiming the heat, and slipped out to the veranda. Alone in the dark, she leaned against the railing, breathing the cooler air off the river. Lanterns bobbed on anchored ships, and faint singing carried from a nearby tavern. The contrast struck her sharply. Inside the ordered world of candlelight and polite conversation, outside the rough, moving world of water and wind. She stayed until the music resumed, then returned only long enough to tell her chaperone she felt unwell. The ride home in the carriage was silent. William said nothing, but his face was set. The inner conflict sharpened through the following months. She felt the pull of two directions. One led to the life her father planned: marriage, a house much like the one she lived in now, children, the slow accumulation of land and status. The other led toward the docks, the ships, the stories of men who answered to no one but their articles and their captain. The second path carried risks she could name: disease, storms, capture by the navy, betrayal by a crew, but it also offered motion, choice, the absence of fixed roles. She began keeping a small notebook hidden under a floorboard in her room. In it, she jotted fragments, names of vessels she had seen tied up, distances between ports mentioned in conversation, rough sketches of rigging copied from sailors' idle drawings on barrel staves. These were not plans yet, only records of possibility. She read them by candlelight after the house slept, tracing the words with her finger as if they might lead somewhere concrete. William's efforts continued. He invited Thomas Fenwick to supper one Sunday in late summer. The young man arrived on a good horse, dressed in a fine coat, carrying a small gift of imported tea for the household. Conversation stayed polite. Crops, weather, the price of indigo. Anne sat across from him, answering questions about her reading and her skill at the harpsichord, which she played adequately but without pleasure. After the meal, Fenwick walked with her in the garden under the live oaks. He spoke of his plans to expand his father's holdings, of building a new house nearer the river. Anne listened, nodded, offered no encouragement. When he left, she watched his horse disappear down the lane, then returned to the stable to brush Bess until her arms ached. The rebellion remained mostly internal. She did not shout or slam doors. Instead, she withdrew further into silence at home, spoke less at meals, spent more hours away. William noticed the change but attributed it to lingering grief or youthful stubbornness. He believed time and a good match would correct it. Anne knew otherwise. The expectations pressing on her from her father, from society, from the careful life rebuilt after Ireland had become a cage she could feel closing. The sea, visible every day from the fields and the porch, represented the only opening she could see. Time. Marriage to James Bonny. The pull toward the docks grew stronger through the winter of 1714 and into the following spring. Anne found herself riding to Charlestown 2 or 3 times a week, always with a reason that could pass inspection, fetching nails for fence repairs, collecting letters from the post office, or checking on a shipment of seed corn William had ordered. Each visit ended the same way. She tied the mare outside the Blue Anchor or the Crown and Compasses and stepped inside for a short while. The taverns were dim even in daylight, their floors scattered with sawdust to absorb spilled drink and tobacco spit. She chose a bench near the back wall, paid for a mug of small beer with coins saved from household errands, and listened. James Bonny first appeared among the crowd one afternoon in early summer. He was an ordinary sailor, perhaps 25, with the sun-browned face and calloused hands of someone who had spent years on merchant vessels. His clothes were plain, a checked shirt faded from washing in seawater, canvas trousers patched at the knees, and a wool cap pulled low against the glare. He had come off a brigantine that had just unloaded sugar from Barbados and was waiting for a new berth. The other men knew him by name. He spoke little but carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to long voyages and short paydays. Anne noticed him because he sat apart, nursing his drink slowly and watching the room without joining the louder conversations. When their eyes met once across the smoky space, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Nothing more. Over the next weeks the pattern repeated. He appeared on days when his ship was in port, always quiet, always listening more than speaking. She learned fragments of his background from overheard remarks. Born in England, served on several trading sloops out of Bristol and London, no family waiting anywhere, content with the sea as his only steady home. He had no grand ambitions beyond steady wages and occasional prizes when privateering commissions were still available. Their connection formed gradually through small exchanges at the edge of the crowd. He would mention a route he had sailed past the Bahamas, through the Florida Straits, and she would ask a single question about wind patterns or the look of the islands. His answers were direct and practical. Nassau was a collection of shacks and tents on New Providence, full of men who had turned to piracy after the war ended, living by their own rules because the royal governors had not yet reached that far. The place sounded raw and alive, free of the plantation routines that pressed on her at home. She stored every detail without showing excitement. At the plantation, the pressure from William increased steadily. He had arranged another meeting with Thomas Fenwick, this time inviting the young man for a full day of riding the fields together. Anne endured the visit with the same outward politeness, but inside she felt the walls closing tighter. The thought of a lifetime tied to rice fields, church services, and polite suppers filled her with a quiet dread that had no name, but grew heavier each week. She compared it to the stories James told of open decks, shared articles that treated every crewman fairly, and ports where no one asked about your past. By late summer, 1715, she had made her choice. She met James more deliberately now, waiting at the dock after his ship tied up and walking with him along the waterfront in the fading light. He spoke of his plans to head south, once the hurricane season eased toward the Bahamas, where former privateers had gathered and were making their own opportunities. The end of the long European war had left hundreds of trained sailors without work. Many had chosen the pirate life in Nassau rather than starve on half-pay in Charlestown. James was considering joining them, not out of rebellion but because the pay was better and the rules simpler. Anne told him her own situation in plain terms. Her father's determination to marry her off to a planter's son, the life of endless domestic management that awaited, the restlessness that had built since her mother's death. James listened without judgment. He offered no promises of wealth or safety, only the reality of shipboard life, hard work, shared danger, and the freedom to leave when the articles no longer suited. That honesty matched her own mood. Within a few weeks they agreed to marry. The decision felt less like romance and more like a practical step toward the path she had been watching from the docks. The wedding took place quietly in October 1715 at a small wooden chapel on the edge of Charlestown. No family attended. Anne wore her plainest linen dress, the one she used for riding, and James stood in his cleanest shirt. The minister, paid a small fee, asked the required questions and pronounced them man and wife with the same tone he used for any couple. They signed the register with their names, and that was all. No feast followed, no gifts exchanged. They spent the first night in a rented room above the Crown and Compasses, listening to the sounds of the harbour through the open window. William learned of the marriage the next morning, when a neighbour who had witnessed the ceremony rode out to the plantation with the news. His reaction was immediate and final. He summoned Anne to the front room and told her in a flat voice that she had chosen her own path and could no longer consider herself part of his household. The disownment was complete. No share of the land, no money from the strongbox, no return to the house she had grown up in. He spoke of the shame it would bring to his standing among the planters and the legal work he depended on. Anne stood listening without argument. She had expected nothing else. When he finished, she turned, walked to the stable, saddled Bess one last time, and rode back to town, with only the clothes on her back and the small bundle of personal items she had prepared in advance. James met her at the docks. He had already arranged passage on a trading sloop bound for New Providence, leaving within the week. The vessel was small, 30 tons, carrying general cargo and a handful of passengers seeking their own fresh starts. The couple paid for their berths with the last coins James had saved from his previous voyage. Anne felt a strange calm settle over her as they waited on the wharf. The plantation life she had known since childhood was behind her now, cut off as cleanly as the scandal in Cork had once been left behind. What lay ahead carried uncertainty storms, scarce food, the rough company of sailors, but it also carried motion. The days before departure passed in the rented room. Anne adjusted to the new daily rhythm. Simple meals of bread and cheese bought from street vendors. Evenings listening to James describe the articles most crews followed in Nassau, equal shares of prizes. No punishment without a vote. Care for the injured from the common fund. She asked about the women who lived there. He answered that a few wives and companions had settled in the shacks along the shore, managing taverns or small gardens while their men sailed. The place was not respectable by Carolina standards, but respectability had never been her goal. On the morning of departure, the sloop cast off with the tide. Anne stood at the rail watching Charlestown shrink behind them, the spire of St. Philip's Church, the warehouses along the Cooper River, the distant line of live oaks marking the plantations. William did not come to the dock. She felt no regret, only a steady forward pull. James remained beside her, pointing out familiar landmarks as they cleared the harbour mouth and the open sea opened ahead. The voyage south took nearly 3 weeks. Slowed by contrary winds and a brief stop at a small island for fresh water, conditions aboard were cramped. Passengers slept on deck when weather allowed. Meals were salt pork and hard biscuit softened in rum water, and the constant roll of the hull tested balance. Anne adapted quickly, helping with small tasks, coiling rope, mending sailcloth much as she had helped in the plantation kitchen. The sailors noticed her steadiness and offered practical advice without mockery. James stayed near, explaining the navigation marks they passed, the low green line of the Florida coast, the scattered cays of the Bahamas. New Providence appeared on the horizon as a low, wooded island fringed with white beaches. Nassau itself was a rough settlement, clustered around a natural harbour, protected by a shallow bar that kept larger warships out. Wooden huts and canvas tents spread along the shore. A few stone buildings near the centre served as storehouses and taverns. Smoke rose from cook fires, and small boats moved constantly between anchored vessels. The air carried the mixed smells of wood smoke, fish, rum, and drying sails. This was the notorious pirate settlement that had grown after the Treaty of Utrecht. Hundreds of men who had once held privateering commissions, now operating outside any king's law, choosing their captains by vote and dividing spoils according to simple articles. James and Anne stepped ashore with their few belongings. They found lodging in a small shack near the water. rented from a former quartermaster who had lost a leg in an earlier fight. The floor was packed sand, the roof thatched with palm leaves, and the single window looked straight onto the harbour. Anne set about making the space livable, sweeping the sand, hanging a hammock for sleeping, arranging their cooking pot and water bucket. James spent the first days seeking a berth on one of the sloops preparing to sail. The settlement operated on its own rhythm. Crews gathered at taverns to sign articles. Ships departed on rumours of rich merchant traffic in the Windward Passage and returned with holds full of sugar, cloth, or coin. For Anne, the move marked the end of one chapter and the clear beginning of another. The disownment from her father had severed the last tie to the planter world she had grown up in. Nassau offered no guarantees food could run short when prizes were scarce. Disease moved through the crowded huts, and the British authorities in Jamaica were already sending warnings about the growing pirate presence. Yet the daily sights and sounds matched the restlessness she had carried since childhood. Sails filling with wind, men planning voyages by consensus, the sea stretching outward in every direction. James settled into the routine easily, his quiet competence fitting the loose order of the place. Anne felt the same quiet competence rising in herself, ready for whatever the next weeks would bring. Move to the Bahamas. The first weeks in Nassau passed in a steady rhythm of small adjustments that turned the rough settlement into something familiar. The shack Anne and James rented sat on a narrow strip of sand just above the high tide line, its palm thatch roof leaking during the short afternoon showers that came almost every day. Inside, the single room held only the hammock they shared, a low table made from a salvaged hatch cover, and a clay pot for cooking over an open fire pit outside. Anne swept the packed sand floor each morning with a bundle of dried palm fronds, then walked the short distance to a communal well to fill the water bucket. The water tasted brackish, but was safer than the open barrels left standing in the sun. The streets of Nassau were little more than wide sandy paths worn down by bare feet and cartwheels. They wound between clusters of huts built from driftwood, canvas, and whatever planks could be scavenged from broken ships. No formal plan guided the layout. Men simply claimed a spot, drove stakes, and raised walls. Taverns stood every 50 yards or so, open-sided structures, with thatched roofs and long benches where crews gathered between voyages. The largest, called the Fortune or the Black Dog, depending on who owned it that month, stayed open from first light until the last man staggered out. Rum flowed from shared casks, served in coconut shells or dented tin mugs. Anne learned quickly to move through these places with purpose, carrying a small basket of bread or fruit she bought from the few women who kept garden patches behind their huts. She kept her eyes forward and her voice low, but she listened to every conversation. James spent his days seeking steady work. He signed onto small sloops that left the harbour on short raids or trading runs to nearby islands. The pay came in shares of whatever cargo they took: sugar, cloth, coins, or sometimes just barrels of salted fish. When he returned, he brought back small amounts of money that kept the shack supplied with rice, salt pork, and the occasional fresh turtle caught by local fishermen. He spoke little about the voyages themselves, only the practical details: how many men were needed for the watch, what the articles of agreement said about dividing spoils, and which captains could be trusted to honour their word. Anne noticed he had begun carrying a short cutlass at his belt and a pistol tucked into his waistband, items he cleaned and oiled each evening by the firelight. The broader shift happening around them gave the settlement its restless energy. The War of Spanish Succession had ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht, closing the long years of fighting between Britain, France, and Spain. Thousands of sailors who had served on privateers, legal raiders holding royal commissions, suddenly found themselves without employment. Many of those same men had drifted to Nassau because the island lay outside easy reach of any royal governor. What had once been licensed attacks on enemy ships turned into outright piracy against any vessel that looked profitable. Crews voted on their captains, wrote simple articles that promised equal shares and care for the wounded, and sailed out in small, fast sloops that could slip through shallow channels where larger warships could not follow. Anne watched these crews assemble at the taverns, men from England, Ireland, Scotland, the colonies, even a few French and Spanish deserters. They spoke of rich merchant ships moving through the Windward Passage carrying sugar from Jamaica or silver from the Spanish Main. Anne adjusted her own habits to match the loose order of the place. She took in laundry for several crews, washing shirts and trousers in a wooden tub behind the shack and hanging them on lines strung between palm trees. The work brought in extra coins and gave her a reason to move freely among the huts. She learned which women had come with their husbands and which had arrived alone, some running small cook shops that sold stewed conch and corn cakes to hungry sailors. Food was simple and irregular, whatever arrived with the ships or could be caught in the shallow waters. She kept a small garden patch of her own, planting sweet potatoes and beans in the sandy soil, weeding it early each morning before the sun grew too hot. Social rules in Nassau were few and practical. Men settled disputes with fists or knives in the open street, and the rest of the settlement stepped aside until the matter ended. Women were expected to manage their own affairs. No one inquired too closely about past lives or legal marriages back in the colonies. Anne carried herself with the same steady calm she had developed on the plantation, answering questions directly but volunteering nothing extra. She avoided the worst of the drinking crowds at night, staying inside the shack when the taverns grew loud and fights spilled into the paths. James warned her once about certain captains known for forcing women aboard, but he trusted her judgment and left her to her own routines. By the middle of 1717, the settlement had grown noticeably. More sloops anchored in the harbour, their decks low in the water from recent prizes. News travelled by word of mouth. A rich French merchant taken off Hispaniola, a British slaver relieved of its cargo near the Florida Straits. The men who returned spent their shares quickly. New clothes, better weapons, nights of drinking that left the taverns echoing until dawn. Anne watched the pattern repeat and began to understand the fragile balance that kept Nassau functioning. Enough successful raids to keep crews fed and armed, but not so many that the royal authorities in Jamaica or Carolina decided to send warships. James's work changed in the spring of 1718, when a new governor arrived from England. Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself, had been sent with a royal commission to restore order in the Bahamas. He brought a small squadron of warships and a clear mandate to offer pardons to pirates who surrendered, or to hang those who refused. The settlement reacted in waves. Some crews accepted the pardon and turned to legitimate trade, others slipped away to more remote cays, and a few openly defied the new authority. James saw opportunity in the shift. He began carrying messages between Rogers's headquarters in the half-finished stone fort and certain captains who wanted to negotiate terms without losing face. The work was quiet slips of paper passed at night, brief meetings in back rooms of taverns, and it paid better than crewing a sloop. Anne asked few questions. She understood that survival in Nassau now required careful alignment with whoever held the strongest hand at any given moment. The streets took on a different tension under the new governor. Rogers posted notices offering full pardons for those who swore loyalty to the king and gave up piracy. Some men burned the papers in public. Others quietly lined up at the fort to sign their names. Taverns that had once echoed with boasts now carried cautious conversations about who could be trusted and who might inform on the rest. Anne continued her laundry work and garden patch, but she moved more carefully, noting which faces disappeared and which new officials walked the paths with armed escorts. James returned from his meetings with small amounts of coin and occasional news. A pardon accepted here, a sloop seized there. He kept his role as informant private, speaking of it to Anne only in low tones after dark when the harbour was quiet. Daily life settled into a new balance. Mornings still began with the water bucket and the garden. Afternoons brought the steady rhythm of washing and mending. Evenings, when James was home, they ate simple meals of fish stew and cornbread beside the fire pit, listening to the waves and the distant voices from the taverns. The end of the war had turned the entire region into a place where former privateers tested the limits of law, and Nassau stood at the centre of that testing. Anne felt the change in the air, less open celebration, more guarded movements, but she also felt the same steady forward motion that had carried her from Carolina. The settlement offered no guarantees of safety or wealth, yet it allowed choices that the plantation life had never permitted. James's new work with Rogers added another layer of quiet calculation to their days, a practical response to the tightening grip of authority that was slowly closing around the pirate world they had joined. Encounter with Calico Jack. The arrival of John Rackham in Nassau changed the daily atmosphere of the settlement in subtle but noticeable ways. He had been sailing for several years already, mostly on small sloops out of Jamaica and the Windward Islands, taking what prizes he could under the loose rules of the post-war years. By late 1718 he had earned the nickname Calico Jack, from the bright striped calico breeches he favoured cloth bright enough to stand out on deck even in the dim light of a storm. He wore them with a loose shirt open at the neck and a wide-brimmed hat cocked to one side, a style that drew eyes whether he intended it or not. Anne first saw him one afternoon near the main wharf. A sloop called the Revenge had just dropped anchor after a run through the Florida Straits. The crew was unloading crates of sugar and bolts of cloth, laughing and shouting as they worked. Rackham stood on the quay directing the men with easy gestures, his voice carrying without effort over the noise. He was not tall but carried himself with a relaxed authority that made others listen. His face showed the marks of the sea sun lines around the eyes, a small scar along the jaw from some earlier fight, but his manner was light, almost amused, as if the work of piracy were a game he played well. She had gone down to the water to collect a small payment from a crew that owed her for laundry. As she waited on the edge of the crowd, Rackham noticed her standing apart and walked over. He asked her name in a casual tone, then introduced himself with a small bow that felt half serious, half mocking. The conversation stayed brief. He commented on the heat, asked how long she had been in Nassau, and mentioned that he liked the look of the settlement now that Rogers had started building a proper fort. Anne answered plainly, without elaboration. She noticed his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, but he said nothing more and returned to his men. The encounter repeated over the following weeks. Rackham's sloop stayed in harbour longer than most, undergoing repairs to the hull and rigging after scraping a reef during the last voyage. He spent evenings in the larger taverns, buying rounds for whoever sat nearby and telling stories of narrow escapes and rich hauls with a storyteller's timing. Anne began to appear at those same places more often, sitting at a side table with a mug of watered rum, listening from a distance. She did not join the circles around him directly. Instead, she let the conversations drift her way through the open-sided walls. Rackham noticed her presence each time. He would catch her eye across the room and raise his mug in a quiet salute before returning to his tale. Once he sent a boy over with a fresh coconut shell of punch, saying it was compliments of the captain. She accepted it without comment and drank slowly while the night wore on. The gesture carried no demand, only a small acknowledgement that she existed in the same space he did. Their first real conversation happened on a quiet evening in early 1719. Most crews were either at sea or sleeping off the previous night's drinking. Anne had walked down to the beach to sit on a low dune and watch the moon rise over the harbour. The water lay flat and silver, broken only by the dark shapes of anchored vessels. Rackham appeared along the same path, carrying a bottle and 2 tin cups. He asked if he could join her, sat on the sand a respectful distance away, and poured them each a measure of rum without waiting for an answer. He spoke first about the sea itself, how the trade winds shifted with the seasons, how a good captain read the sky more than the charts. Anne listened, then asked about the Revenge's last prize, a small French merchant carrying wine and cloth from Martinique. He described the boarding in simple terms. The other ship had struck colours quickly, no shots fired, the cargo divided according to the articles within the hour. She asked about the articles themselves, how they were written, who decided the shares, what happened when someone broke them. He explained the basics equal division, after the captain and quartermaster took their portions, No stealing from the common store, punishment by vote for serious offences. The rules sounded fairer than the rigid hierarchy of merchant ships or the unspoken rules of the Carolina plantations. The talk turned personal without either of them forcing it. Rackham mentioned that he had no family waiting anywhere, no land to return to, only the deck under his feet and the next horizon. Anne spoke briefly of her own path leaving Charlestown, the disownment, the choice to follow James to Nassau. She kept the details sparse, but he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once and said the sea had a way of taking people who did not fit elsewhere. There was no pity in his voice, only recognition. After that night, the meetings became more regular. They walked the beach paths together when the settlement was quiet, or sat on the porch of the shack Anne shared with James while he was away on short voyages. Rackham brought small gifts, sometimes a length of bright cloth for a new skirt, a handful of fresh limes from a recent prize, a silver coin stamped with a Spanish king that he said she could keep for luck. The gestures stayed light, never pressing for more than she offered. Anne accepted them in the same spirit, using the cloth to sew a practical shirt she could wear when working, squeezing the limes into water to cut the taste of the brackish well. James remained absent for longer stretches. His work as an informant for Governor Rogers kept him moving between the fort and the taverns, passing messages and gathering names of captains who refused the pardon. He returned tired, spoke little, and slept heavily when he was home. Anne continued the laundry and garden routines, but her attention had shifted. The hours spent with Rackham felt different from the steady practicality of her marriage. He carried stories of open water and quick decisions, of nights under full sail with the deck tilting beneath bare feet. The carefree manner masked a sharp mind. He knew exactly which routes merchant ships favoured, how to spot a fat prize from a distance, when to run and when to fight. The connection deepened through shared silences as much as words. They sat together on the beach watching ships come and go, or leaned against the wall of a tavern listening to the same songs the crews sang. Anne found herself laughing at his dry observations about the pompous officials Rogers had brought with him, or nodding when he described the boredom of long watches broken only by the cry of a lookout spotting sail. She began to notice small habits of his, the way he rolled a coin across his knuckles when thinking, the quick glance he gave the horizon even when sitting on land, the easy way he handled a knife or pistol as if they were extensions of his hands. Inside, the contrast with her life in Charlestown grew sharper. There she had felt every expectation like a weight marriage prospects, household duties, the careful silence her father demanded. Here, with Rackham, the days carried possibility. He spoke of sailing again soon, perhaps on a larger vessel if he could gather enough men who trusted him. He did not ask her to join. The question hung unspoken between them. Anne felt the old restlessness stir again, stronger now, fed by the stories and the quiet hours they shared. James noticed the change without naming it. He came home one evening to find Rackham sitting on the porch steps, talking with Anne about the best anchorages on Eleuthera. James greeted him civilly, joined the conversation for a few minutes, then went inside to clean his pistol. Later, alone with Anne, he asked how long she had known Calico Jack. She answered truthfully several weeks, mostly chance meetings in public places. James said nothing more, but the question stayed in the air. The pull toward Rackham's world grew steady and undeniable. He represented the freedom she had glimpsed at the Charlestown docks years earlier. Motion, choice, a life shaped by votes and articles rather than inherited rules. James offered stability in Nassau's shifting landscape, a quiet partnership built on practical needs. Rackham offered something else, the chance to step fully into the sea life she had watched from the edges since childhood. The decision formed slowly, not in a single moment but through accumulated hours of talk, shared rum, and the sight of sails filling with wind. By mid-1719 the choice had settled inside her. She would leave James and join Rackham when his next voyage began. The break would be clean, no arguments, no public scene. She would pack her few belongings into a small sea chest and walk to the Revenge when it prepared to sail. The settlement would notice, as everything in Nassau noticed, but no one would interfere. Women had left husbands before, men had left wives. The articles of a pirate crew would become her new rules, the deck her new home. The encounter with Calico Jack had ignited the ambition that had simmered since her mother's death and the disownment in Carolina. It offered a path forward that matched the restlessness she carried, a way to claim the sea that had always lain just beyond the fields and docks of her earlier life. Embracing. Piracy. The decision to leave James settled quietly inside Anne during the humid weeks of mid-1719. She made no dramatic announcement. One morning, when James had already left for the fort to deliver another message to Governor Rogers, she packed her belongings into a small canvas sea bag. The linen shifts she had sewn herself, the bright calico cloth Rackham had given her, a spare pair of sturdy shoes, the short knife she kept in her boot, and the handful of coins saved from laundry work. She left the shack exactly as it had been. No note, no overturned chair, nothing to suggest anger or haste. The door simply closed behind her for the last time. She walked the sandy path to the Revenge, anchored near the mouth of the harbour. The sloop rode low in the water, freshly careened and rigged with new lines. Crewmen moved across the deck, stowing water casks, coiling rope, checking the powder magazine. Rackham stood at the rail, watching the preparations. When he saw her approaching with a bag over her shoulder, he gave a small nod and extended a hand to help her aboard. No words passed between them in that moment. The action itself carried the understanding they had built over months of quiet meetings. Anne stepped onto the deck and felt the slight give of the planks under her feet, different from the solid earth of Nassau's paths. The ship smelled of fresh tar, oakum, and the faint salt of recent caulking. She found a place near the mainmast out of the way of the working men, and waited while the final stores came aboard. Rackham spoke to her briefly once the loading finished. She would share the small cabin aft with him, eat from the common mess, and stand watch like any other hand. There were no special concessions for being a woman. The articles would apply the same. She agreed without hesitation. The Revenge slipped her moorings with the evening tide and cleared the bar under a light breeze from the southeast. Nassau shrank behind them until only the low line of palms and the smoke from cook fires remained visible. Anne stood at the larboard rail watching the island fade. She felt no regret for leaving James or the shack or the laundry tubs. The open water ahead carried the same steady pull she had known since childhood, now finally met. Life aboard settled into patterns quickly. The crew numbered about 30 mostly English and Irish sailors, a few Scots, one Dutchman who spoke little but handled the helm with steady skill. They had signed articles the week before sailing. Equal shares of all prizes after deductions for the ship and the wounded, no gambling with dice aboard, no striking another man without cause brought before the company, punishment decided by majority vote. Rackham read the articles aloud on deck before they left Nassau, and every man, including Anne, placed a mark or signature beside his name on the paper tacked to the mast. She received the same clothing allowance as the others, a checked shirt, canvas trousers cut to fit her frame, a wool cap, and a pair of pistols with powder horn and shot pouch. She kept her hair tied back tightly under the cap and moved about the deck in the loose trousers, finding them far more practical than skirts for climbing the ratlines or hauling on sheets. The first days she spent learning the ship's routines, how to belay a line properly, how to furl a sail without tearing it, how to read the compass card by lantern light during the middle watch. The men watched her at first, curious but not hostile. When she pulled her weight without complaint, scrubbing the deck at dawn, taking her turn at the helm, helping to reef the mainsail, in a sudden squall, they accepted her as part of the company. Daily food followed the standard for small sloops. Hard biscuit baked weeks earlier in Nassau, salt pork or beef boiled in the galley's copper cauldron, occasional dried peas or beans when the cook had time to soak them. Fresh water came from casks filled at the last stop. Each person received a measured pint per day, rationed carefully to last until the next landfall. Rum was served twice daily, once at noon with dinner, once at supper to cut the thirst and the taste of the water. Anne learned to sip hers slowly, mixing it with lime juice when the fruit lasted. She took part in the ordinary work of the ship without exception. During the morning watch, she helped the bosun check the standing rigging for wear, feeling the tarred ropes for loose strands or rot. In the afternoon, she joined the men mending sails on deck, plying a large needle with sail twine until her fingers grew stiff. At night, she stood her turn at lookout in the foretop, scanning the dark horizon for lights or the pale shape of another sail. The motion of the ship became familiar, the slow roll in a following sea, the sharper pitch when beating to windward, the way the deck tilted underfoot when the wind freshened. Rackham proved a steady captain. He kept discipline light but firm, relying on the articles rather than shouts or the lash. Decisions about course or when to engage a prize came after brief consultation with the quartermaster and a show of hands from the crew. Anne participated in those votes when they concerned the whole company. She spoke when she had something useful to add observations about wind shifts noticed from her watch, or the behaviour of distant sails, but she never forced her opinion. The men listened when she did speak. Her time on the docks and her steady manner had earned that much. The first prize came 2 weeks out, a small English merchant brig carrying tobacco and rum from Virginia to Jamaica. The Revenge overhauled her easily in a fresh breeze, firing a single gun across her bow as a signal to heave to. The brig struck her colours without resistance. Anne went across in the boarding party with 6 others, pistols tucked in her belt and cutlass in hand. The merchant captain surrendered his papers and cargo manifest without argument. The hold yielded 60 hogsheads of tobacco, 20 puncheons of rum, and a small chest of Spanish dollars. The prize crew took command of the brig while the Revenge escorted her back toward a quiet quay where the cargo could be divided. Back on the sloop, Anne helped tally the spoils. Each man received his share according to the articles. Full shares for the crew, 1.5 for the captain and quartermaster, half shares for the boys and the cook. She received a full share like the rest, the coins and goods placed in a small sack she stowed in the cabin. The tobacco and rum would be sold in Nassau or traded for powder and canvas when they returned. The experience felt straightforward. No unnecessary violence, no long chase, just the work of taking what the ship carried and moving on. After that capture, Anne began to adopt occasional male disguise when going ashore or during boarding actions where surprise mattered. She bound her breasts tightly with strips of canvas, wore a loose shirt over them and kept her hair hidden under the cap. The change was simple and practical, the trousers and shirt already fit the role, and the binding made movement easier during climbs or fights. The crew accepted it without comment. Several had sailed with disguised hands before, and the articles cared only about contribution, not appearance. She grew accustomed to the constant motion, the salt that crusted everything, the way clothes never fully dried in the damp air below deck. She developed habits that fit the life, checking her pistols each morning for rust, keeping her powder dry in a leather pouch worn under her shirt, tying a kerchief around her neck to wipe sweat during heavy work. Sleep came in snatches 4 hours on, 4 off swinging in the hammock strung between the beams, lulled by the creak of the hull and the slap of water along the sides. The freedom she had craved since watching ships from the Charlestown docks now surrounded her in concrete form. No one dictated her hours beyond the watch bill. No one expected her to manage a household or smile politely at suitors. Decisions came from the group, or from the wind, and the lookout's cry. She felt the same guarded calm she had carried since childhood, but now it served a different purpose, keeping her steady on a rolling deck, alert during a night approach, calm when boarding a stranger vessel. Rackham remained the centre of her days. They shared the small cabin aft, talking in low voices after the watches changed, planning the next course or simply sitting in companionable silence while the lantern swung overhead. He treated her as an equal partner in the venture, consulting her on small matters of sail trim or crew temperament, trusting her judgment when she offered it. The connection stayed practical, built on shared work and shared risk rather than declarations. The Revenge continued her patrol through the summer months, taking small prizes when opportunity appeared, a fishing smack off Andros, a coasting sloop carrying salt from the Turks Islands. Each capture added to the stores and the crew's confidence. Anne took part in every action, proving her nerve with the same quiet steadiness she applied to every task. The life suited her exactly as she had imagined it might. Hard, uncertain, but shaped by her own choices rather than anyone else's expectations. Routines aboard the ship The Revenge settled into a working rhythm that turned the days and nights into something predictable, despite the constant motion of the Caribbean. Anne found herself rising with the change of watch at 4 a.m, stepping from the small cabin aft into the damp pre-dawn air. The deck planks felt cool and slightly sticky under her bare feet from the dew that collected overnight. She moved to her assigned station near the mainmast, taking her place among the other hands for the morning scrub. Each person received a bucket of seawater and a holystone, the porous block of sandstone that they pushed back and forth across the wood until the surface gleamed white and smelled faintly of salt. The work took an hour if the crew moved steadily, and Anne pushed with the same even pressure she had once used on the plantation floors, her shoulders settling into the motion while the ship rolled gently beneath them. Watch duties rotated every 4 hours, giving everyone a share of daylight and darkness. Anne stood at the helm for 1 turn each day, feet braced against the deck, hands on the heavy wheel while she kept the sloop steady on the compass heading Rackham had ordered. The needle swung in its brass binnacle, and she corrected with small turns, feeling the pressure of wind on the sails through the rudder. During the afternoon watch, she often climbed the ratlines to the foretop, sitting in the lookout's perch with a spyglass balanced on her knee. From there the sea stretched out in every direction, broken only by distant K Islands or the occasional line of clouds building on the horizon. She scanned for sails, noting their shape and direction, then called down the details to the deck below. The height gave her a sense of the ship's small size against the vast water, a perspective that both steadied her and reminded her how quickly everything could change. Dividing captured goods happened whenever a prize had been secured and brought to a quiet anchorage. The crew gathered on deck around the main hatch while the quartermaster oversaw the count. Each item, hogsheads of sugar, barrels of rum, bolts of cloth, small chests of coin, was brought up and listed aloud. The articles of agreement were read again if anyone needed reminding. The captain received 1.5 shares, the quartermaster the same, every able seaman 1 full share, and the boys or cook half. Anne stood in the circle like the rest, receiving her portion in a small canvas sack that she later stowed in the cabin. The process stayed orderly, with no arguments once the vote had confirmed the division. She noticed how the men's faces relaxed after a fair count, the tension of the chase replaced by the simple satisfaction of having something tangible to show for weeks at sea. The coins or trade goods gave a brief sense of security, enough to buy powder, canvas, or fresh stores when they next touched land. Meals followed the same schedule regardless of weather. The cook lit the galley fire in the early morning, boiling salt pork or beef in the copper cauldron until the meat softened enough to chew. Hardtack came from the bread room below, the flat biscuits so dry they needed to be soaked in the broth or pounded with a mallet to break them. Anne ate her portion sitting on deck with her back against the bulwark, chewing slowly to make the food last and washing it down with the measured pint of water drawn from the scuttlebutt. The taste stayed the same for weeks, salty, slightly rancid if the cask had been open too long, but she grew used to it the way she had once grown used to corn porridge on the plantation. When the cook managed to catch fish over the side or trade for fresh turtle at a small island, the meal improved for a day, and everyone lingered longer over their bowls. Grog arrived twice each day, mixed in the galley and passed around in tin mugs. The rum came from captured stores or the last resupply in Nassau, watered down at a ratio of 1 part spirit to 3 parts water to stretch the supply and keep the men steady rather than drunk. Anne took her measure at noon and again at supper, sipping it slowly while the warmth spread through her chest. The drink cut the constant thirst from salt air and helped blunt the edge of fatigue after a long watch. She developed the habit of swirling the mug before drinking, watching the liquid catch the light, and noting how the strength varied depending on how much fresh water remained. On calmer evenings, the crew sat in small groups on deck after the meal, passing the mugs again in silence or humming low work songs while the ship moved through the dark, clothing adapted to the rolling waves and the damp heat of the region. Anne kept her canvas trousers belted tightly at the waist and rolled the legs above the knee during heavy deck work so they would not catch on ropes or hold water. The checked shirt stayed loose for air circulation, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She bound her chest with a wide strip of linen each morning before dressing, the fabric tight enough to flatten her shape for easier movement, but not so constricting that breathing became difficult. A wool cap covered her hair, pulled low to keep strands from whipping across her face in the wind. When rain came, she added a tarred jacket taken from the slop chest, the heavy canvas shedding water while she worked the pumps or secured loose gear. The constant motion of the ship taught her to brace her feet wide apart when standing, to move with the roll rather than against it, and to keep one hand free for a line or rail. Shoes stayed below in the cabin unless they went ashore. Barefoot on deck gave better grip and let her feel the subtle shifts in the hull's movement. The crew's habits shaped the atmosphere as much as the routines. The Dutch helmsman checked the compass every half hour and muttered corrections to himself in his own language. A Scottish gunner spent his free time cleaning the small swivel guns mounted along the rail, wiping each barrel with an oily rag and testing the flint. The cook, an older man from Bristol, kept a running tally of stores in his head and warned the quartermaster when salt meat ran low. Anne observed these small patterns without comment, fitting her own pace into the groups. She developed the habit of checking the rigging each evening before turning in, running her hands along the shrouds to feel for any fraying strands that might part in the next blow. The task calmed her, a quiet way to ensure the ship stayed ready. Weeks passed in this steady cycle. The Revenge cruised the waters between the Bahamas and the northern coast of Cuba, taking small prizes when sails appeared on the horizon and slipping into hidden cays when larger warships were rumoured nearby. Anne felt her body strengthen with the constant work arms firmer from hauling lines, balance surer on the tilting deck. Her mind stayed alert during watches, cataloguing wind shifts and cloud formations the way she had once tracked the rice fields' water levels. The life carried no luxury, but it offered the freedom she had sought. Decisions made by the group, danger shared equally, no one dictating her days beyond the needs of the ship. Fears surfaced in quieter moments below deck. She thought occasionally of naval patrols growing bolder under Rogers's orders back in Nassau, of the possibility that a faster frigate might overtake them in open water. The image stayed brief, pushed aside by the immediate tasks at hand. Ambitions grew in the same practical way. She imagined commanding a small watch herself one day, or understanding enough navigation to plot a course from the charts spread on the cabin table. These thoughts remained private, stored alongside the growing collection of coins in her sea bag. The political forces tightening around the pirate world reached even the routine of shipboard life. News passed from captured vessels or from sloops they met at sea, more governors offering pardons, more warships sent from Jamaica and Carolina. The crew discussed these reports in low voices while dividing stores, but the articles and the daily work kept the focus narrow. Anne absorbed the tension without letting it alter her pace. The ship's routines became a shield against the larger uncertainty. Watch, meal, grog, sleep. Repeat until the next cry from the lookout changed everything. She adapted her clothing further as the weeks turned to months. When the sun grew fierce, she kept a wet kerchief around her neck to cool the skin. In heavier seas, she lashed a line around her waist when working near the rail, the rope giving security against a sudden roll. The Caribbean waves, warm and sometimes playful, sometimes steep and breaking, taught her their moods through the soles of her feet and the tilt of the deck. She learned to anticipate the larger swells that came after a distant storm, shifting her weight before the ship rose and fell. Caribbean Raids the Revenge continued her patrols through the late summer and into the autumn of 1719, following the trade routes that merchant ships favoured after leaving the larger ports. The sloop moved in a loose pattern, north toward the Florida Straits to catch vessels bound from the Carolinas, then east along the northern coast of Cuba, and back toward the Bahamas when stores ran low or a storm threatened. Anne spent her watches scanning the horizon from the foretop or the bowsprit, learning to distinguish the cut of a merchant brig from a fishing smack or a naval tender by the shape of the sails and the height of the masts against the sky. One clear morning in October, the lookout called down the first sighting of the day, a small English snow, 2 masts with square sails on both, hull painted black with a yellow stripe, carrying perhaps 20 tons. She lay about 5 miles to the southwest, beating slowly against the wind on a course that would take her past the eastern tip of Cuba toward Jamaica. Rackham ordered the helm put over and the sails trimmed for a faster reach. The Revenge responded quickly, her clean bottom and light load allowing her to close the distance within 2 hours. Anne stood near the rail during the approach, watching the other vessel grow larger until the details became clear. A low freeboard, a deck crowded with casks and crates, a crew of perhaps 12 men visible moving about their work. The chase ended without gunfire. Rackham ordered a warning shot fired across the snow's bow from one of the swivel guns. The ball splashed into the water 20 yards ahead, kicking up a white plume. The merchant captain struck his colours immediately and hove to. The Revenge came alongside, grappling hooks thrown and secured. Anne went across with the boarding party of 8, cutlass in hand and pistols tucked into her belt. The merchant crew stood in a loose line on deck, hands raised, faces showing the resignation of men who knew resistance would only bring worse. The captain, a middle-aged man from Bristol with a greying beard, handed over his papers without protest, manifest showing rum, sugar, and tobacco bound for Kingston. The hold yielded 20 puncheons of rum, 40 hogsheads of sugar, and several bales of tobacco wrapped in coarse canvas. The boarding party worked quickly, passing the casks up through the hatch and across to the Revenge on ropes slung between the 2 ships. Anne helped lower the heavy puncheons to the deck, bracing her feet against the roll and guiding each one into place so it would not shift when the ship moved. The tobacco bales came next, stacked in the hold where space remained. The coins, a small chest containing about 300 Spanish dollars, went into the quartermaster's care for later division. The entire operation took less than 3 hours. The merchant captain was allowed to keep enough provisions to reach port safely, and his crew received no harm beyond the loss of cargo. Back aboard the Revenge, the goods were stowed securely and the articles consulted for the division. Each full share came to roughly $20 in coin, plus a proportionate amount of rum and sugar that could be traded later. Anne received her portion in the same canvas sack as the others, the weight of the coins solid against her palm. The capture felt routine by now. Approach, signal, board, transfer, depart. No blood spilled, no prolonged fight, just the steady work of taking what the sea routes offered and moving on before any pursuit could organise. The crew conducted several more raids in the following weeks. A French fishing boat off the Caicos Islands surrendered without a shot, yielding salted cod, barrels of fresh water, and a few live turtles kept in the hold for meat. Anne helped secure the turtles on deck, tying their flippers so they could not flip themselves overboard during the swell. Another prize was a small sloop carrying indigo dye from South Carolina to Barbados. The boarding went smoothly again. The captain, a young man on his first command who looked more relieved than angry when the colours came down. The indigo cakes, wrapped in leaves and packed in wooden boxes, added colour to the whole deep blue blocks that stained the hands of anyone who handled them. Anne wiped the dye from her fingers with seawater and a rag, noting how the colour lingered under her nails for days afterward. These actions left visible marks on the surrounding waters. Merchant captains began travelling in small convoys when possible, or hugging the coast to stay within sight of land batteries. The economic chaos from the recent wars lingered in the region. High prices for sugar and rum in Europe drove ships to sea despite the risks, while reduced naval patrols after the Treaty of Utrecht left gaps that sloops like the Revenge could exploit. Anne saw the pattern clearly from her lookout, post the steady flow of trade that refused to stop, the thin line of protection that governments could offer in these distant waters. During one raid near the Windward Passage, the Revenge encountered stiffer resistance. A Dutch flight carrying coffee and logwood from Curaçao attempted to run when spotted. Rackham ordered all sail set and the crew to prepare the guns. Anne helped run out the starboard battery 4 small carriage guns and load them with round shot. The fluid proved slow and heavy. The Revenge closed within pistol range inside an hour. A single broadside from the sloop carried away part of the fluid's rigging and splintered the rail. The Dutch captain struck soon after. The boarding party found the crew shaken but unhurt, the hold full of coffee beans in burlap sacks and logwood logs stacked tightly. Anne carried several sacks to the deck, the beans shifting under the coarse fabric with a dry rustle. The capture added to the stores, but the brief exchange of fire left a reminder that not every prize would surrender quietly. The crew adapted their tactics accordingly. They preferred night approaches when possible, using the cover of darkness to close without being seen until the last moment. Anne took part in these stealthier runs, standing silent at the rail while the ship ghosted forward under reduced sail. She learned to read the faint phosphorescence in the wake, to listen for the creak of another vessel's blocks or the murmur of voices carried on the wind. When the moment came to board, she moved across the gap with the others, stepping lightly onto the enemy deck and securing lines to keep the ships together. The raids brought not just goods but information. Captured captains and crews spoke freely once surrender had come. News of naval movements out of Jamaica, rumours of pardons being offered in Nassau, reports of merchant ships expected on certain routes. Rackham listened carefully, noting details on a rough chart spread in the cabin. Anne sat nearby during these interrogations, adding observations when she had them. The look of a distant sail earlier that week, the direction of the wind that might push a convoy off course. Her contributions stayed practical and brief, but they helped shape the next course. Daily life between actions remained the same, steady round. Anne continued her turns at the helm, the lookout, the deck scrub. She kept her pistols dry and loaded, her cutlass sharpened with a whetstone passed among the crew. The Caribbean sun browned her skin further, the salt air roughened her hands, and the constant motion strengthened her balance until she no longer needed to think about bracing against the roll. Fears of capture or storm stayed present but distant, pushed aside by the immediate demands of the ship. The raids accumulated small wealth and larger experience. Each capture taught something new: how a certain hull handled when laden, which captains fought and which surrendered, the value of different cargoes in Nassau's markets. Anne absorbed these lessons as naturally as she had once learned to manage the rice fields. The economic disruption left by years of European war continued to feed the cycle. High demand in the colonies and Europe kept ships sailing. Thin naval presence kept them vulnerable. The Revenge moved through this space with the same quiet efficiency she applied to every task, taking what the sea offered and leaving the rest untouched. The pattern of approach, boarding, transfer, and departure became as familiar as breathing. Anne felt the life settle around her completely now. The creak of the hull at night, the taste of grog at noon, the weight of coin in her sack after a fair division. The Caribbean waters carried them forward, one raid at a time, through the loose edges of a world that still had not decided how to close them. Meeting Mary Read the Revenge, anchored in a sheltered bay on the lee side of a small, uninhabited cay near the northern edge of the Bahamas chain in late November 1719. The spot offered fresh water from a spring that trickled down a low limestone bluff, good holding ground for the anchor, and a narrow entrance that kept larger vessels out. The crew had come here to careen the sloop after weeks of steady sailing, had fouled the bottom with weed and barnacles. They ran the ship aground on the rising tide, heeled her over with tackles and ballast shifted to one side, then scraped the exposed hull clean with broad-bladed tools and coated it with a fresh layer of tallow mixed with sulphur to discourage marine growth. While the work proceeded, Anne walked the short stretch of beach each morning to gather driftwood for the cook fire. The sand felt warm underfoot even before the sun rose high, and the water lapped clear and shallow over patches of white coral. On the third day, she noticed another small vessel already at anchor. Farther along the bay, a single-masted sloop of similar size to the Revenge. Her hull painted a faded green with no name visible on the stern. A handful of men moved about her deck, and a thin column of smoke rose from a fire on the shore nearby. Rackham sent a boat across in the afternoon to make contact. The other captain came back with them, a short, wiry man named James, who spoke with a slight West Country accent and carried himself with the same cautious confidence as most men in these waters. He reported that his crew had taken a prize off the Caicos a fortnight earlier and were now repairing minor damage before heading south toward the Windward Passage. The two captains spoke on the beach for an hour, comparing notes on recent sightings and the increasing presence of naval patrols out of Jamaica. When the conversation turned to crew matters, James mentioned that one of his hands had been injured during the last boarding and was recovering in the shade of a makeshift tent ashore. Anne volunteered to carry fresh water and a small portion of the Revenge's remaining salt pork to the injured man. She rowed across in the dinghy with one other crewman, landed on the beach, and followed a faint path through low scrub to the tent. Inside lay a figure on a pallet of sailcloth stretched over crossed oars. The person wore loose trousers and a checked shirt like the rest of the crew, hair cropped short under a cap pulled low. When Anne set down the bucket and the wrapped meat, the figure sat up slowly, revealing a face that showed clear signs of recent pain, pale skin, a bandage wrapped around the upper left arm where a cutlass slash had gone deep enough to require stitches. The injured sailor thanked her in a low, steady voice and introduced himself as Mark Reed. Anne noticed the careful way the person moved, the slight wince when shifting weight, and the direct gaze that met hers without flinching. They spoke briefly about the wound, how it had come during a scuffle on the deck of the prize, how the bleeding had stopped after pressure and rum-soaked cloth, how the stitches held but pulled with every movement. Anne offered to change the dressing if needed. Mark accepted, and she set about cleaning the cut with boiled water from the bucket and rewrapping it with a strip of clean linen she carried in her pocket. Over the next 2 days, while both ships remained careened, Anne returned several times with more water, a bit of hardtack, and once a small flask of rum from the Revenge's stores. Each visit brought a few more words exchanged. Mark spoke of sailing out of Jamaica several years earlier, of serving on merchant vessels before joining the sloop, of the practical reasons for keeping to the articles and avoiding captains who drank too much or fought among themselves. The voice stayed quiet but clear, the stories told without embellishment. Anne listened and offered her own brief accounts. The crossing from Carolina, the time in Nassau, the routines aboard the Revenge. She did not press for details, and Mark did not offer more than necessary. On the second afternoon, Anne noticed small details that did not quite align with the usual patterns of a male sailor. The way the shirt hung across the chest, the slight curve of the hip when Mark shifted to sit upright, the careful way the person avoided unnecessary movement that might strain the binding beneath the clothes. Anne said nothing at first, only continued the conversation as before. Later that evening, alone in the cabin with Rackham, she mentioned her suspicion in low tones. Rackham listened, nodded once, and said he had noticed the same things, but saw no reason to interfere as long as the articles were followed and the work done. The next morning, Anne walked the beach again and found Mark sitting on a low rock near the water's edge, watching the tide creep in. She sat beside the rock at a comfortable distance and asked directly, without preamble, whether Mark had ever sailed under another name. The question hung in the air for a moment. Mark looked out across the bay, then turned back with a small, wry smile. The answer came plainly. The name had been Mary Reed once, born in England to a widow who raised her as a boy to secure a small pension meant for a son. The disguise had continued through service in the army in Flanders, then aboard ships, then into the Caribbean. Mary had kept the male name and appearance because it opened doors that stayed closed to women better pay, the right to bear arms, the freedom to move without constant scrutiny. Anne absorbed the information without surprise. She had already guessed the truth from the small signs and the way Mary carried herself with the same guarded competence she recognized in herself. Mary spoke of the practical advantages. No need to explain a woman's presence on a ship. No special treatment that might breed resentment. The ability to fight and work on equal terms. She had joined James's crew after a brief stint in Port Royal, drawn by the promise of quicker shares and fewer questions. The wound had come when she defended her place during a boarding. She had held the line until the prize struck. The two women talked more openly after that. They shared details of their paths without sentiment or drama. Mary described the army camps in the Low Countries, the rough discipline of soldiering, the way she had learned to handle a musket and a sword alongside men who never suspected. Anne spoke of the Carolina plantation, the disownment, the pull of the docks that had led her to Nassau and then to the Revenge. They compared notes on practical matters, how to keep bindings dry in salt air, which knots held best when climbing rigging in a hurry, how to sharpen a cutlass so the edge bit cleanly without dulling too fast. The conversation stayed grounded in the daily realities of the life they both lived. When the ships prepared to refloat and sail again, Mary asked if she might join the Revenge. Her own sloop had lost 2 men to fever and another to a dispute that ended in a knife fight. The captain had agreed to let her transfer if a berth opened. Rackham consulted the crew in the usual way, a show of hands after a brief discussion of her skills and the articles. The vote passed without objection. Mary came aboard with her sea bag and her weapons, taking a hammock slung near the foremast where the air moved freely. Aboard the Revenge, the two women developed a close, quiet bond built on mutual understanding. They stood watch together when schedules allowed, sharing the foretop or the helm in companionable silence broken only by necessary calls about wind or sail trim. They exchanged practical knowledge. Mary showed Anne a better way to tie a Spanish bowline that held under strain. Anne demonstrated how she kept powder dry by wrapping the horn in oiled cloth. They worked side by side during deck scrubs or sail repairs, moving in rhythm without needing to speak. The crew treated them both as full hands, no special deference, no extra tasks because the articles demanded it, and their work earned it. The presence of 2 women aboard changed nothing in the formal order of the ship, yet it created a small space of shared experience amid the all-male company. They spoke in low tones during night watches about the limits of disguise, the moments when the binding chafed or the cap slipped, the relief of dropping the pretense in private moments below deck. Neither sought to change the other's path. They simply recognized the same choices in different forms. Mary's steady nerve during boarding actions matched Anne's own, and together they formed a reliable pair when the cry came to prepare for another prize. The meeting with Mary Read brought a new layer to the life Anne had chosen. It confirmed that the path she walked had been travelled before, by someone who had made the same calculations and reached the same conclusions. The bond remained practical and understated, grounded in the shared routines of deck work, watch standing, and the quiet knowledge that each understood the other's reasons without needing them explained. Spreading. Reputation. The Revenge returned to Nassau in early December 1719, with a hold full of recent captures rum from the English snow, coffee and logwood from the Dutch fluit, indigo cakes that still stained the deck planks blue in places. The crew anchored in the familiar harbour, the water crowded with other sloops that had spent the season cruising the same routes. Word of their arrivals spread quickly through the settlement. Men from other crews came aboard to hear the details, asking about the size of the prizes, the resistance offered, the shares each hand had received. Anne and Mary stayed on deck during these visits, coiling line or checking the rigging while the conversations flowed around them. The stories began to circulate beyond the immediate circle. Sailors who had shared grog with the Revenge's men carried the accounts to other taverns. A quartermaster from a larger brig told how 2 women had stood in the boarding party without hesitation, cutlasses drawn and pistols ready, moving across the deck of the prize as steadily as any man. Another hand described Anne's calm handling of the swivel gun during the brief exchange with the Dutch flight, the way she aimed and fired without rushing the shot. Mary's reputation grew from the same sources. The quiet resolve she showed when the wound in her arm had barely healed, the way she kept her place in the line during boarding actions even while the stitches pulled. These accounts spread through Nassau's loose network of taverns and beaches. Men repeated them over mugs of rum or while mending sails on the sand. The details grew slightly in the retelling. Anne's pistol shots became more precise. Mary's sword work more decisive, but the core remained accurate. Two women living and fighting under the articles, taking full shares, contributing without seeking special treatment. The stories reached the fort where Governor Rogers's officers listened and made notes. They travelled south to Jamaica on merchant vessels that stopped in Nassau for water, carried by captains who had heard the talk and passed it along in Port Royal taverns. Anne noticed the change in how people looked at her when she walked the paths between the shacks. Eyes followed her longer than before, some with curiosity, others with a mix of respect and wariness. She kept her routine the same, buying fresh conch from the women who sold it near the well, collecting her laundry payments, checking the garden patch behind the shack she now shared with Rackham. The attention did not alter her pace, but she felt it like a current running beneath the surface of daily life. Men stepped aside when she passed in narrow places, not out of deference but because they knew her name carried weight now. Mary experienced the same shift. When she went ashore to buy powder or canvas, vendors quoted prices without haggling as much as before. Other women who lived in the settlement, wives of captains or those running small cook shops, nodded to her with a quiet acknowledgement when their paths crossed. One evening, a former servant from a Jamaican plantation approached Mary near the beach and asked in low tones how she had managed to join a crew. Mary answered plainly. She had dressed and worked as a man, proved her worth with a blade and a pistol, and let the articles decide the rest. The woman listened without speaking, then walked away carrying the same guarded look Anne recognised from her own early days in Nassau. The reputation brought practical effects. When the Revenge prepared for her next cruise in January 1720, more men applied to join than the sloop could carry. Rackham held a meeting on deck, read the articles aloud, and let the crew vote on each applicant. Several were accepted, others turned away because the ship had no room. Anne and Mary stood among the voters, raising hands when they judged a man's skills, useful navigation knowledge, gunnery experience, steady hands in a blow. Their votes carried the same weight as any other hands, and the new crew accepted that without question. Ports beyond Nassau began to hear the names. A captured merchant captain, released after his cargo had been taken, reported the incident in Charlestown to the customs officers. He described the sloop's captain as Calico Jack, the raid as quick and orderly, and mentioned two women among the boarding party, one with red hair tied under a cap, the other shorter with cropped dark hair. The details appeared in a letter sent to the Board of Trade in London, tucked among reports of other depredations in the region. Naval officers in Jamaica read similar accounts from returning masters, adding the names Anne Bonny and Mary Read to lists of known pirates operating out of New Providence. The growing talk carried both advantage and risk. Merchants adjusted their routes when possible, sailing closer to fortified harbours or joining convoys escorted by armed sloops. Naval commanders received orders to seek out the Revenge specifically, with descriptions of the women included in sailing instructions. Anne felt the tightening circle during longer cruises, fewer prizes sighted, more days spent running before the wind to avoid distant sails that might belong to a frigate. The crew discussed these changes in quiet groups on deck, weighing the risks against the shares still possible. No one suggested disbanding. The articles held them together, and the sea still offered opportunities for those willing to take them. Anne and Mary spoke of the spreading stories during night watches in the foretop. They sat side by side on the narrow platform, backs against the mast, legs dangling over the edge while the ship moved beneath them. Mary pointed out that the attention made boarding actions more dangerous prizes now knew to expect women among the attackers, which sometimes led to quicker resistance from crews who wanted to avoid the added shame of being taken by women. Anne agreed, but noted the flip side. Some merchant captains surrendered faster when they saw the same faces among the boarders, preferring to lose cargo rather than risk a fight against known reputations. The two women developed small habits to manage the visibility. They kept their hair covered at all times ashore, avoided standing alone in crowds, and moved together when walking through the settlement. They sharpened their weapons more often, checked powder and shot before every cruise, and practiced cutlass drills on deck when the wind stayed light. These preparations stayed practical, part of the routine rather than a reaction to fear. The reputation had come unasked, built from actions rather than boasts, and they met it with the same steady competence they applied to every task. In Nassau, the stories mixed with the ordinary talk of the place. Men in the taverns raised mugs to Calico Jack's crew when the Revenge was in port, toasting the women who had earned their shares without flinching. Others spoke in lower voices about the danger the Navy would hang them higher if captured, the noose reserved for those who defied the pardons most openly. Anne and Mary heard both sides and let the words pass without response. They continued their work, standing watch, handling prizes, dividing spoils according to the articles. The reputation grew around them, like a current they could not stop, carrying them forward while they kept their hands on the ropes and their eyes on the horizon. The wider world of the fading golden age of piracy pressed closer with each month. British governors tightened their grip, pardons came with stricter conditions, warships patrolled the passages more frequently. Yet the stories of Anne and Mary spread through the loose network of sailors and merchants, creating a quiet legend that both protected and endangered the small band. The women carried the weight of it without complaint, proving their nerve in every action, refusing to back down when the moment required resolve. The reputation had become part of the life they had chosen, useful in some ways, hazardous in others, but always met with the same calm determination that had brought them this far. Pirate, society, and forces. The wider currents of the pirate world moved around the Revenge, like the trade winds that pushed her from one quay to the next. By early 1720, the settlement at Nassau had lost some of its earlier openness. Governor Rogers had rebuilt parts of the stone fort overlooking the harbour, posting armed guards at the main gate and sending small patrols through the sandy paths each evening. The taverns still filled at night, but the conversations carried a new caution. Men who had once boasted openly about their last prize now spoke in lower voices or stepped outside to finish their sentences. Anne and Mary noticed the shift when they went ashore for stores. Fewer new faces among the crews, more familiar ones who had accepted pardons and now worked on legitimate trading sloops. The loose alliances that held the pirate groups together operated on simple agreements rather than formal treaties. Crews from different sloops met at hidden anchorages to share intelligence about merchant routes or naval movements. Rackham's men sometimes joined forces with another captain for a larger raid, combining firepower for a few days before separating again to avoid drawing too much attention. Anne took part in one such meeting off Andros Island in February, where the Revenge lay alongside a brig from Jamaica. The two captains consulted on deck while the crews swapped rum and tobacco. The discussion stayed practical: which passage the next sugar fleet would likely use, how many guns each ship carried, the exact division of any joint prize. No signatures were required. A handshake and a shared mug of grog sealed the arrangement. The alliance lasted only until the target was taken. Then each vessel went its own way. Mary observed these meetings with the same quiet attention she gave to everything. She pointed out to Anne that the alliances worked because every man understood the articles applied only to his own ship. No single leader controlled the whole group, and that absence of central command kept the Navy guessing. The two women sat on the rail during these gatherings, listening to the captain's plans and noting which crews seemed steady and which carried too many hot heads. The pattern reminded Anne of the way planters in Carolina had formed temporary partnerships for a harvest or a road repair. Except here, the stakes involved powder and steel instead of rice and timber. The lingering influence of the old Nassau Republic still shaped daily choices. Years earlier, when the island had operated almost as its own small state, crews had voted on every major decision and shared the harbour as common ground. That spirit remained in the way men still gathered to settle disputes by majority vote rather than by the captain's word alone. Anne saw it in action one afternoon when two crews argued over a disputed water cask on the beach. Instead of fighting, they called a quick meeting under a palm tree, heard both sides, and decided the shares by show of hands. The decision stood without further complaint. The habit had survived Rogers's efforts to impose order because it suited the men who had chosen this life precisely to escape stricter hierarchies. Daily routines in Nassau reflected the same loose structure. Anne and Mary continued their laundry work for extra coin when the Revenge was in port, but they now washed shirts for several different crews rather than one. The women who ran the cook shops along the shore traded gossip about which governors had sent new warships and which captains had slipped away to Cuba. Food remained whatever the sea and the small gardens provided: conch stew thickened with cassava, fresh fish grilled over driftwood, occasional shipments of corn from passing traders. Clothing stayed practical trousers and shirts patched until the fabric gave way, then replaced from captured stores. The settlement had no formal church services or courts. Disputes went to the crews themselves, and illness was treated with rum, rest, and whatever herbs the older hands remembered from their earlier lives. The tightening grip of British authority pressed from multiple directions at once. Rogers sent regular reports back to London detailing the names of active captains and the sloops they commanded. Naval commanders in Jamaica received orders to cruise the Windward Passage more frequently, and small frigates began appearing on the horizon during the Revenge's patrols. Anne felt the change in the air during longer cruises. Fewer merchant sails in open water, more cautious approaches to any prize. The crew discussed the situation in quiet groups while dividing stores or standing watch. They understood that the pardons offered earlier had come with a deadline, and those who refused them now faced higher risks. Rackham kept the articles posted on the mast and reminded everyone that the company could vote to accept a pardon at any time, but the vote had to be unanimous. No one raised the question seriously. The shares still came regularly enough to keep the men committed. Political forces from Europe reached the Caribbean in delayed waves. The end of the long wars had left the British Navy with more ships available for colonial duty, and the sugar trade had grown valuable enough that London demanded protection. Anne learned these details from captured captains who talked freely once their vessels had been relieved of cargo. They spoke of new acts passed in Parliament, of governors rewarded for clearing the seas, of insurance rates rising for any ship sailing without escort. The information helped Rackham plan routes that avoided the busiest patrol areas, but it also narrowed the safe waters month by month. Mary and Anne talked about these pressures during the quiet hours between watches. They sat on the foredeck at night, legs stretched out on the planks, voices low so the helmsman could not hear. Mary described how the same tightening had happened in European waters years earlier, when governments had finally turned their full attention to the privateers who had served them during wartime. Anne compared it to the way Carolina planters had slowly pushed out smaller farmers once the land became profitable. Both women understood that the loose pirate society could not last indefinitely. The forces gathering against it were larger and more organised than any single crew. The culture aboard the Revenge adapted to the changing conditions without losing its core habits. The men still sang the same work songs when hauling anchor or reefing sail, still divided grog by the same measure, still settled minor quarrels with a quick vote. Anne and Mary maintained their steady places in the rotation: helm, lookout, deck work, boarding parties. They kept their weapons ready and their bindings secure, but they no longer needed to discuss the small adjustments. Each knew the other's routines as well as her own. The ship itself felt familiar now, the creak of specific timbers, the way the bow rose to certain swells, the exact pitch of Rackham's voice when he called for sail changes. Loose alliances continued to form and dissolve as needed. One week the Revenge sailed in company with two other sloops to approach a convoy rumoured off Hispaniola. The next week they separated again when naval sails appeared on the horizon. The partnership stayed temporary and practical, built on shared risk rather than loyalty. Anne voted with the others on whether to join each new group, weighing the extra guns against the extra mouths to feed. The decisions remained collective, a small echo of the old Nassau Republic that had once governed the entire harbour. The tightening grip showed in smaller daily signs. Rogers posted new notices in Nassau, offering rewards for information on specific captains, including Rackham. Men who had once drunk openly now carried their mugs inside shuttered rooms. Anne and Mary moved through the settlement with extra care, never lingering in one place too long. Yet the life continued. Watches stood, prizes taken when opportunity allowed, shares divided according to the articles. The pirate society around them had begun to shrink, but the forces that had shaped it, war's end, distant governments, the lure of quick wealth still held the small band together for the time being. Anne felt the balance shifting inside her as well. The reputation that had spread earlier now mixed with the knowledge that the world outside was closing in. She kept her habits unchanged, checking powder, standing her watch, sharing quiet words with Mary, but she stored the larger picture in the same steady way she stored coins in her sea bag. The loose alliances, the lingering spirit of the Republic, and the governor's determined reach formed the background against which every day played out. The Revenge moved through these forces like any other sloop, taking what the sea offered, while the larger order slowly tightened around the entire region. Mounting pressures, the spring of 1720 brought a sharper edge to every day aboard the Revenge. Naval patrols out of Jamaica had doubled since the turn of the year, and the crew felt the change in the reduced number of merchant sails crossing their paths. Rackham adjusted the sloop's course more frequently, swinging north toward the Florida Straits one week and east along the Cuban coast the next, always keeping the low cays in sight as possible hiding places. Anne stood her lookout turns with extra care, the spyglass pressed to her eye longer than before, scanning not just for fat prizes but for the clean lines of a frigate or the low silhouette of a naval sloop that could outgun them in open water. The strain showed first in the stores. Water casks emptied faster on the longer evasion runs, and the cooks stretched the salt pork thinner each day. The crew received the same measured pint of water and the same grog ration, but the mood at meals grew quieter. Men chewed their hardtack in silence, eyes on the horizon instead of on each other. Anne noticed the small shifts. The helmsman checking the compass twice as often, the gunner running his hands along the swivel guns, even when no sail appeared. She kept her own habits steady, binding her chest each morning, sharpening her cutlass at the same hour, checking her powder horn for damp, but inside she felt the weight of the extra vigilance pressing on everyone. Pardons offered by Governor Rogers had begun to feel like a closing door rather than an open choice. The first round in 1718 had carried a simple oath and a promise of safety. The new notices posted in Nassau carried stricter terms and shorter deadlines. Men who had accepted earlier pardons now found themselves pressed into naval service or watched closely if they returned to the sea. Rackham read the latest proclamation aloud on deck one calm afternoon, the paper held against the wind while the crew gathered around the mainmast. The vote to stay outside the pardon passed without dissent, but Anne saw the hesitation in a few faces. She understood the calculation. The articles still held them together. Yet every week without a prize made the offer look less foolish to some. Anne began reflecting on the limits of their wandering life during the long night watches. She sat in the foretop with Mary, the two of them sharing the narrow platform while the ship rolled beneath them. The stars stayed clear above the dark water, and the only sounds came from the creak of rigging and the slap of waves along the hull. She thought of the years since leaving Carolina, the move to Nassau, the marriage to James, the step onto the Revenge, and saw how each choice had narrowed the space around her. The freedom she had sought now carried its own chains. Constant movement to avoid capture, reliance on the next prize for food and powder, the knowledge that the sea offered no permanent home. She kept these thoughts private, speaking only of wind shifts or distant lights, but the inward accounting stayed with her through the dark hours. The people around her depended on her resolve in ways that grew clearer each week. Rackham consulted her more often on small decisions, whether to risk a run toward a sighted sail or slip into a quay, instead trusting her steady judgment from the lookout post. Mary relied on their quiet partnership during boarding preparations, the two of them checking each other's weapons and bindings without needing words. The newer hands who had joined after the spreading reputation looked to both women for the calm example they set when the cry came to prepare for action. Anne felt the responsibility settle on her shoulders like an extra layer of canvas in a blow, not heavy enough to break her but impossible to ignore. Daily life adapted to the mounting tension without breaking its rhythm. The deck scrub still happened at dawn, the holystones moving back and forth across the planks while the sun rose behind them. Anne pushed with the same even pressure, her arms finding the familiar motion even when her mind stayed on the horizon. Meals remained at the fixed hours, the cook boiling the thinning rations in the galley cauldron and ladling them out with the same wooden dipper. Grog came twice a day, the measure watered down further to stretch the supply, and Anne sipped hers slowly while leaning against the bulwark. She developed the habit of saving a small portion of her biscuit for later, tucking it into her shirt pocket against the chance of a sudden chase that might delay the next meal. The political forces closing in reached the ship through captured vessels and passing news. A small fishing smack taken off Andros carried a passenger who had spoken with officials in Nassau. Rogers had sent fresh requests to London for more warships, and the governors of Carolina and Jamaica had agreed to share intelligence on pirate movements. The passenger repeated the details under quiet questioning in the cabin, his voice steady because no harm had come to him or his boat. Rackham listened without interrupting, then ordered the man released with enough provisions to reach the nearest port. Anne stored the information beside her other observations, the increased number of lanterns on distant shores at night, the absence of familiar trading sloops that had once crossed their path regularly. Mary felt the strain in her own way. During the afternoon watches, she sometimes spoke of the army days in Flanders, how the same tightening pressure had come before battles when supply lines shortened and orders grew stricter. She compared it to the way the pirate world now shrank week by week, the safe anchorages fewer, the routes narrower. Anne listened and nodded, then returned to scanning the sea. The bond between them stayed practical, a shared recognition that the life they had chosen carried an ending they could both see approaching. The crew began to show small signs of fatigue. One man asked during a division of stores whether they might consider a short run to Cuba to sell what they had and rest. The question brought a quick vote, and the majority decided to stay at sea. Anne raised her hand with the rest, but she understood the undercurrent. The wandering had started to wear on them all. She reflected again on the limits she felt inside the absence of any fixed place to return to, the constant calculation of risk against reward, the way the people around her now looked to her for the same steadiness she had once drawn from the routines of the plantation. Naval sails appeared more often on the edges of their horizon. Twice in April the Revenge had to run before the wind for a full day, all hands on deck trimming sails and pumping the bilges when the chase grew close. Anne worked the lines alongside Mary, her hands raw from the rope, but her movements automatic. The ship responded well, slipping into a shallow channel between two quays where the larger vessel could not follow. They lay there for 2 days, anchor down, sails furled, the crew speaking in whispers while they waited for the patrol to pass. The experience left a quiet tension that lingered even after they sailed again. Anne kept her inner reflections separate from the daily work. She continued to stand her watches, divide the small spoils according to the articles, and maintain her weapons with the same care. Yet the wandering life now felt bounded in ways it had not before. The sea still stretched outward, but the safe space within it had begun to shrink. The people who depended on her, Rackham with his light command, Mary with her steady partnership, the crew with their shared articles reminded her daily that resolve alone might not hold against the forces gathering beyond the horizon. The pressures mounted steadily through the early summer. Stores grew leaner, patrols grew bolder, and the pardons that had once seemed optional now carried the weight of a final choice. Anne met each day with the same calm she had carried since childhood, but inside she measured the limits of the path they had taken and the quiet dependence that had grown around her. The Revenge moved forward under reduced sail, evading what it could and taking what small prizes still appeared, while the larger order of the Caribbean tightened its grip 1 week at a time. The capture, the summer of 1720 turned into autumn, without any easing of the pressures that had built around the Revenge. The sloop had spent weeks dodging larger naval vessels, slipping into shallow bays along the Cuban coast, and then swinging north again toward the open water between Cuba and Jamaica. Stores were low, the water casks nearly empty, the salt meat reduced to thin strips that the cook boiled twice to make them last. Anne felt the change in the daily rationing, the grog cut with even more water, the hardtack saved for the longest watches. The crew spoke less during meals, their eyes on the horizon instead of on each other. But the articles still held and the watches rotated exactly as before. In mid-October, they sighted a small coastal trader hugging the northern shore of Jamaica, carrying barrels of salted fish and a few casks of rum from a local plantation. The Revenge closed on her in a steady breeze, fired one warning shot, and the trader struck her colours within minutes. The boarding went quickly. Anne and Mary went across with the usual party, secured the deck, and supervised the transfer of the cargo. The fish and rum filled the hold enough to give everyone a decent meal that evening, and a full measure of grog without stretching the supply. The captured captain, a quiet man from Kingston, was allowed to keep his papers and enough provisions to reach port. The Revenge moved away before dusk, heading for a quiet anchorage near Negril Point on Jamaica's western coast, where the water was deep enough for safety, but the land rose in low hills that hid the masts from distant patrols. The crew voted to anchor there for the Maker. Night. The bay offered protection from the prevailing wind, a sandy bottom for good holding, and no immediate signs of other vessels. Rackham gave the order to lower the sails and drop the anchor just after sunset. The men worked steadily, coiling lines and securing the guns, then gathered on deck for the evening meal. The fresh fish tasted better than anything they had eaten in weeks, and the rum from the prize loosened the tension that had built through the long evasion runs. Someone started a song, the old one about the wind and the waves, and soon half the crew joined in. The grog went around again, this time undiluted, and the voices grew louder as the stars came out. Anne sat near the mainmast with Mary, eating her portion slowly and watching the others. The men had been careful for months, keeping watches tight and voices low, but the small prize and the safe anchorage loosened something in them. They passed the mugs freely, laughing at stories from earlier raids, clapping each other on the shoulder. Rackham joined them for a time, his calico breeches bright even in the lantern light, then retired to the cabin with a full mug. Anne and Mary took their usual measure but stopped after one, knowing the night watch still needed steady hands. They spoke quietly about the next day's course, agreeing to suggest a short run toward the Caymans if the wind held. The conversation stayed practical, the same tone they had used since the careening on the quay. The drinking continued long after the meal ended. The men sprawled on deck or leaned against the bulwark, mugs in hand, voices slurring as the rum took hold. One by one they drifted into sleep where they sat, heads on coiled rope or against the mast. The lanterns burned low, casting soft circles of light on the planks. Anne checked the anchor line once, then took her place at the helm for the middle watch while Mary stood lookout in the foretop. The ship lay still in the calm bay, the water lapping gently against the hull, the only movement, the slow swing of the lanterns. Neither woman saw the approach at first. Captain Jonathan Barnett's armed sloop had left Jamaica earlier that day under orders to hunt active pirates in the area. His vessel carried more guns than the Revenge, and a crew of trained naval hands who moved without noise. They came in under reduced sail, using the darkness and the low hills to cover their approach, the lanterns doused and the oars muffled when they drew close. Barnett had received reports of Rackham's sloop in these waters, and had positioned his ship to cut off the bay's narrow entrance. Anne noticed the change when the first grapples hit the rail. The sound was soft but unmistakable, metal scraping wood. She turned the helm slightly to feel the ship's response, and saw dark shapes moving across the gap between the vessels. Mary called down from the foretop at the same moment, her voice low but clear. The two women moved without hesitation. Anne secured the wheel and drew her pistols and cutlass. Mary slid down the ratlines with her own weapons ready. The rest of the crew remained where they had fallen, the rum holding them in heavy sleep. Barnett's men boarded in force, 20 or more, stepping onto the deck with cutlasses drawn and pistols cocked. Anne fired first, aiming at the nearest boarder and dropping him with a clean shot to the chest. The flash lit the deck for an instant, showing the surprised faces of the attackers. Mary fired her pair of pistols in quick succession, hitting 2 more before they could close the distance. The noise finally stirred some of the Revenge's crew, but the men rose slowly, fumbling for weapons, their movements clumsy from the drink. A few managed to stand and swing a cutlass before falling back under the weight of the boarders. Anne and Mary fought side by side near the mainmast. Anne parried a cutlass strike with her own blade, then drove the point home in a short thrust that ended the fight for that man. Mary moved with the same steady precision, blocking a pistol shot with her cutlass and stepping inside the attacker's reach to finish him with a single blow. The deck became a confusion of shadows and steel, but the two women held their ground, covering each other's flanks and calling out warnings when another boarder approached from the side. The rest of the crew could not rally. The rum had done its work too well, and most lay where they had dropped or were quickly overpowered. Barnett himself came aboard once the fighting slowed, ordering his men to secure the prisoners. He recognized Rackham and the others from the descriptions that had circulated for months. Anne and Mary continued to resist, even as the numbers against them grew. Anne swung her cutlass in a wide arc that kept 3 men at bay until one landed a glancing blow to her arm. Mary fired her last loaded pistol and then used the empty weapon as a club to knock another boarder back. Their stand lasted longer than any of the men's, long enough for Barnett to pause and watch with a mixture of surprise and respect. The fight ended when the boarders finally surrounded them. Anne and Mary lowered their weapons only when further resistance would have meant pointless injury to themselves and the already subdued crew. Shackles went on their wrists, the iron cold and heavy after the heat of the fight. The Revenge's men were rounded up and transferred to Barnett's sloop, some still half asleep and protesting weakly. The captured vessel was taken in tow, her sails set under Barnett's command for the short run back toward Spanish Town. Anne stood on the deck of the new vessel as the bay receded behind them, the shackles chafing against her skin. Mary stood nearby, their shoulders touching in the crowded space. The night air felt cooler now, carrying the smell of the Jamaican shore. The crew around them remained quiet, the effects of the rum mixing with the shock of sudden capture. Anne felt the same steady calm she had carried through every watch and every raid. The end had come suddenly, but she had met it with the same resolve she had shown since stepping aboard the Revenge. The political forces that had tightened month by month had finally closed, yet the two women had held their ground longer than anyone else on the ship. The short voyage to port passed in silence, broken only by the creak of the hull and the orders from Barnett's officers. Anne and Mary sat together on the deck, wrists bound, watching the dark coast slide past. The capture had come at the end of a long season of evasion, triggered by the one night the crew had allowed itself to relax. The rum, the safe anchorage, the small prize, all of it had combined in a way no one had planned. Only the two women had remained clear-headed enough to fight, and their resistance had become part of the story that would travel with them to the court in Spanish Town. The sloop made port by morning. The prisoners were marched ashore under guard, the chains rattling on the stone wharf. Anne and Mary walked with the others, their steps steady despite the weight of the iron. The sun rose over the hills behind the town, lighting the wooden buildings and the dirt streets that led to the jail. The wider world of governors and naval orders had caught up at last, but the two women carried the memory of their stand on the deck through the short journey inland. The capture marked the end of the wandering life they had known, yet it had come on their own terms, with their weapons in hand and their partnership unbroken. Trial in Jamaica, the prisoners from the Revenge reached Spanish Town under a heavy guard on the morning after the capture. The town lay inland from the coast, its streets lined with low stone and wooden buildings that housed the colonial administration, the courts, and the jail. The air felt thicker here than on the water, carrying the smells of wood smoke, livestock, and the faint rot from the nearby river. Anne and Mary walked in the middle of the line, wrists still shackled, the iron links clinking softly with each step. The rest of the crew shuffled behind them, some still groggy from the rum, others silent with the realization of what waited ahead. They were taken first to the jail, a squat stone building with thick walls and iron-barred windows set high above the ground. The guards marched them down a narrow corridor to separate cells. Anne and Mary were placed in adjoining cells with a small barred window between them that allowed quiet conversation when the guards moved away. The space measured perhaps 6 feet by 8, with a stone floor, a single wooden bench, and a bucket in the corner for necessities. The air stayed warm and still, heavy with the scent of damp stone and unwashed bodies from previous occupants. A thin layer of straw covered the floor in places, but most had been trampled into dust. The guards removed the shackles once the women were inside, replacing them with lighter leg irons that allowed movement within the cell, but prevented running. Food came once a day at first, a bowl of cornmeal mush mixed with a little salt pork, a piece of hard bread, and a tin cup of water. Anne and Mary ate slowly, saving small portions for later when hunger sharpened during the night. They spoke in low voices through the bars, sharing observations about the jail's routines, the shift changes of the guards, the sounds of other prisoners down the corridor, the distant clang of the courthouse bell marking the hours. The trial was set for the 28th of November, 1720, in the Vice Admiralty Court housed in a larger stone building near the centre of town. The prisoners were brought in chains under armed escort, marched through the streets while small crowds gathered to watch. Anne walked with her head up, eyes forward, feeling the weight of the leg irons but keeping her steps even. Mary matched her pace beside her. The courtroom itself was a plain chamber with high ceilings, wooden benches for spectators, and a raised platform where the judge and his assistants sat. The air inside carried the smell of polished wood, candle wax, and the faint sweat of the assembled crowd. The trial proceeded under the authority of the 1717 Act of Parliament that extended the jurisdiction of Vice Admiralty courts to piracy cases in the colonies. The judge, a colonial official appointed for the purpose, read the charges aloud. That John Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Read and the others had, on divers days and times between August and October 1720, committed acts of piracy and felony upon the high seas, contrary to the laws of the realm. The evidence came from Captain Barnett's testimony, from the captured papers and cargo found aboard the Revenge, and from the confessions of several crew members who had turned King's evidence in exchange for leniency. Rackham was called first. He stood in chains before the bench, his calico breeches still bright but stained from the capture. The judge asked if he had anything to say in his defence. Rackham answered that he had sailed under articles agreed by the company, that no unnecessary violence had been used in their actions, and that he had accepted no pardon because he believed the offers carried hidden conditions. His words stayed calm, but the courtroom remained silent except for the scratch of quills on paper as the clerks recorded every line. The judge pronounced the verdict quickly: guilty of piracy. Sentence followed immediately: death by hanging. Rackham was led away without further words. The rest of the male crew followed in turn. Most offered little defence. Some repeated Rackham's points about the articles, others simply stood mute. The court found them all guilty. Sentences of death were passed on each in the same measured tone. Anne and Mary were called last. They stood side by side before the bench, leg irons clinking softly when they shifted weight. The judge addressed them directly, noting that the evidence showed they had taken active parts in boarding actions and in the resistance during the capture. Barnett's testimony was read aloud: how the two women had fought alone after the men had fallen drunk, how they had continued to resist even when the deck was overrun. The clerk listed the specific charges: that they had willingly joined the pirate company, borne arms, and committed acts of piracy upon merchant vessels. No distinction was made for their sex in the formal reading. The law treated them as any other member of the crew. Anne spoke first when asked if she had anything to say. She stated plainly that she had sailed under the Articles, that she had taken her full share of the work and the prizes, and that she had never forced any man to join or harmed anyone beyond what the Articles allowed in defence of the ship. Mary followed with a similar statement. She had served as a full hand, followed the votes of the company, and fought only when the ship was attacked. Neither woman begged for mercy or offered excuses. They spoke without raising their voices, the words clear and direct in the quiet courtroom. The judge paused before delivering the verdict. He noted that the evidence against them was clear, and that the law made no exception for women in cases of piracy. Both were found guilty. Sentence of death followed as it had for the others. The courtroom stirred slightly at that point, murmurs from the spectators, a few sharp intakes of breath, but the judge continued without pause. He then asked the standard question, whether either woman knew of any reason why sentence should not be passed. Anne answered that she believed herself to be quick with child. Mary stated the same. The judge ordered the women examined by a midwife under court supervision. The examination took place the next day in a private room within the jail. A midwife from the town, experienced in such matters, confirmed that both women were indeed pregnant. The report was presented to the court, and the judge ruled that execution would be suspended until after the births. The men, including Rackham, received no such reprieve. They were taken away to await the gallows set up near Gallows Point on the coast. Anne and Mary returned to their cells with the sentence hanging but deferred. The jailers treated them with slightly more caution after that extra food appeared in the daily ration, a thin blanket for the bench, no unnecessary rough handling when the guards passed. The two women spoke through the bars each evening, their voices low to avoid being overheard. They discussed the coming months, the births that would delay the noose, the uncertain fate afterward, the small details of daily survival in the cell. Neither expressed fear. The conversation stayed practical, focused on what could be controlled. Rackham's execution came a week later. The prisoners heard the distant drum roll and the muffled shouts from the town square as the condemned men were marched to the gallows. Anne and Mary sat in silence during that hour, listening to the faint sounds carry on the wind. When the bells tolled the end, they exchanged a brief look through the bars and returned to the small routines of the cell, pacing the limited space, folding the blanket, saving portions of bread for later. The pregnancies progressed slowly in the confined conditions. The jail provided extra cornmeal and occasional fresh fruit when the market supplied it. Anne felt the first movements in early December, small flutters that she noted quietly during the night. Mary experienced the same a few weeks later. They shared the details in low voices, comparing sensations and timing without drama. The midwife visited once a month, checking progress and bringing small comforts. A clean cloth for washing, a bit of soap when it could be spared. The jail routine remained steady. Guards changed shifts at dawn and dusk. Food arrived at midday, the bucket was emptied each morning. Anne and Mary kept their cells as clean as possible, sweeping the straw into corners, wiping the bench with a damp rag. They exercised within the limits of the space. Slow walks back and forth, arm stretches to maintain strength. The leg irons stayed on, the chain just long enough to allow movement but short enough to remind them of their status. The wider world outside the jail continued its own course. News of the trial reached Nassau and Charlestown through returning ships and official dispatches. The stories grew in the telling. The women who had fought to the last, the drunken crew, the captain in his bright calico. Anne and Mary heard fragments from guards who spoke freely when they thought the prisoners could not overhear. The accounts varied, but the core remained. 2 women had stood when the men had fallen, and that fact alone had marked them in the record. The suspended sentences gave them time, but no certainty. The births would come, and then the court would decide again. Anne and Mary prepared as best they could in the small space, counting the days, noting changes in their bodies, maintaining the same steady calm that had carried them through every watch and every raid. The cell walls stayed close. The air remained warm and still, but the quiet partnership between them held firm. They faced the waiting months with the same practical resolve they had brought to every part of the life now ended. 18. Mysterious afterlife and legacy. The births came in the early months of 1721, separated by only a few weeks. Anne's child arrived first, a boy born in the dim light of the jail cell with a midwife and a female guard present. The labour lasted through the night, the stone walls muffling the sounds that carried down the corridor. Mary's daughter followed soon after, the process quieter but no less steady. The jail provided extra blankets and a small amount of milk when it could be spared from the town's supply. Both children were healthy enough under the circumstances, small but strong, with the same watchful eyes their mothers carried. The newborns stayed with their mothers in the cells for the first weeks. Anne cradled her son during the quiet hours, feeding him what milk she could produce and supplementing with thin gruel when necessary. Mary did the same, the two women passing small comforts through the bars, a clean rag for wiping, a bit of softened bread. The guards allowed the arrangement without interference, perhaps because the women had caused no trouble since the trial or because the sight of infants softened the routine of the place. The cells remained small and airless, but the presence of the children introduced a different rhythm. The soft sounds of breathing, the occasional cry that echoed off the stone, the careful movements required to keep the space clean. No formal record exists of what happened next. The court had suspended the sentences until after the births, but the law required execution to follow once the women were no longer with child. Yet the expected return to the gallows never came. Weeks turned into months, and the guards continued to bring the daily ration without mentioning any date for the noose. Rumours began to circulate in Spanish Town and Kingston. One story claimed that a private arrangement had been made, perhaps through a sympathetic official or a bribe paid by someone connected to Anne's family in Carolina. Another suggested that the governor himself had quietly intervened, unwilling to hang women who had recently given birth and whose cases had already drawn attention in London. Anne's fate after the trial fades into uncertainty. Some accounts from the period mention a woman matching her description seen in Charlestown several years later, living quietly under a different name and raising a child away from the docks. Others claim she was quietly released after the child was weaned and taken in by a family with ties to her father's old circle, though William Cormac had died in the meantime and left no public acknowledgement of her. The records of the Carolina colony show no clear trace of her return, but the absence of documentation does not rule out a discreet re-entry into a society that had once known her as a scandal. Mary's path remains equally shadowed. A few scattered references in Jamaican court papers and private letters suggest she may have been transported to another colony, or simply disappeared from the jail rolls after a certain date. One persistent rumour held that she died in prison of a fever that swept through the cells in the summer of 1721, though no burial record confirms it. Another version claimed she secured her release through the same quiet channels that may have saved Anne, then vanished into the Caribbean ports, where women who had once sailed as men could blend into the crowds without drawing notice. The children's lives are even less documented. No baptismal records, no guardianship papers, no mentions in wills or land transfers point to their futures. They may have been raised by relatives, placed with local families, or carried away to places where their origins would remain unknown. The lack of detail is itself a kind of protection. In a world that recorded piracy trials with meticulous care, the quiet disappearance of 2 infants born in a jail cell served to close the chapter without fanfare. The myths that grew around Anne Bonny and Mary Read began almost immediately. Sailors in Nassau and Port Royal told versions of their story over grog, how they had fought when the men lay drunk, how they had stood defiant in the courtroom, how they had perhaps escaped the noose through cunning or mercy. The tales spread to London through merchants and naval officers, appearing in broadsides and pamphlets that sold on street corners. Printers added flourishes, Anne's red hair blazing in battle, Mary's sword work unmatched, turning the two women into figures larger than the small sloop they had sailed. By the middle of the 18th century, their names appeared in collections of pirate histories, often alongside Blackbeard and other captains whose stories had been embellished for print. The accounts varied in accuracy. Some correctly noted their pregnancies as the reason for the delay in execution. Others invented romantic backstories or dramatic escapes. The truth that they had lived ordinary pirate lives under the Articles, taken their shares, fought when required, and met capture with the same resolve they had shown throughout, became buried under layers of legend. Centuries later, the stories still echo. Anne Bonny's name appears in books, films, and popular accounts of the golden age of piracy, usually as the fiery redhead who defied every expectation of her time. Mary Read is remembered alongside her, the woman who had lived as a man through war and sea, her disguise a practical choice rather than a disguise for adventure. The details of their later lives remain unknown, a gap that allows the myths to persist. No grave markers, no final letters, no clear descendants trace back to them with certainty. What survives is the record of their choices. They left the constrained worlds they had known Anne from the Carolina plantation and the marriage arranged for her. Mary from the army and merchant ships where she had hidden her sex and stepped into a life governed by votes, articles, and shared risk. They proved themselves through steady work and quiet nerve, earning full shares in the respect of their company. When the end came, they met it with the same calm, fighting longer than the men around them and facing the court without pleas or excuses. The legacy lies not in the myths that grew afterward, but in the simple fact of their existence. In an age when women were expected to remain within narrow roles, they chose the deck over the household, the cutlass over the needle, the sea over the shore. They navigated the loose pirate society on its own terms, contributing without seeking special treatment, and when the forces of order finally closed in, they held their ground until the last possible moment. Their stories remind that the sea has always carried people who did not fit elsewhere, who sought motion instead of settlement, choice instead of expectation. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were two such people. They lived briefly in the open light of the Caribbean, then slipped back into shadow, leaving behind names that still echo through the centuries. The details of their final years remain uncertain, but the record of their defiance does not. In the quiet of a jail cell, in the months after their children were born, they waited with the same steady calm they had carried through every watch and every raid. Whatever path they took afterward, whether release, escape, or an unmarked end, the choice had always been theirs. The wind still moves across the same waters they sailed. The quays and passages remain, though the sloops are gone and the articles forgotten. Their names linger in the stories told on decks and in taverns, a small reminder that even in the tightest grasp of law and custom, two women once claimed their place on the open sea and held it until the end. Take a slow breath now. Feel the weight of the day ease from your shoulders. The lights are low, the room quiet except for the soft hum you may have turned on earlier. Let the story settle around you like a blanket.